Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and it's so nice to have you here tonight, wherever you are right now. Whether you're in bed, lying on the couch, or just looking for a quiet moment, I want you to know this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the weight of the day start to fade. Let your mind settle, let your body relax, and let yourself simply be. There's no rush, no pressure, just this calm, quiet moment. If you'd like, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in a peaceful place. Maybe it's a cozy room with soft, warm lighting. Or maybe it's under a starry sky, with a gentle breeze brushing against you. Wherever you feel safe and calm, let yourself drift there. By the way, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Feel free to share in the comments. I always enjoy hearing from you. And if this little moment of peace feels just right, tapping the like button or subscribing is a lovely way to let me know you like more moments like this. No pressure, of course, just if it feels right. Tonight's story is gentle and soothing, perfect to carry you into a deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. The truck's rumble faded as I stood on the cracked stone pathway leading to the house. My house, a creaky, two-story relic that had been standing long before I was born. Its windows stared blankly back at me, smudged with decades of grime. The paint, what little was left, peeled in long, curling strips, revealing weathered wood beneath. I adjusted the box in my arms, already regretting the decision to move in without giving the place a second visit. But money was tight, and after the divorce, this house was all I could afford. Still, it had a certain charm, if you squinted hard enough. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. The floor groaned under my boots as I stepped into the front hall, a narrow corridor lined with faded wallpaper. The real estate agent had called it vintage. I called it old. I dumped the box in what would soon be my living room. The house was cold, even though it was late spring, and the windows rattled faintly in their frames as the wind picked up outside. "Cozy," I muttered, my voice echoing too loudly. I stood there for a moment, hands on my hips, surveying the room. The shadows in the corners seemed a little too deep. I shook it off. The next few hours passed in a blur of unloading boxes and hauling furniture from the U-Haul into the house. By the time I was done, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the rooms in a dim, gray light. I was exhausted, but satisfied. I pulled a beer from the cooler I'd brought, popped it open, and collapsed onto the couch. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister. "Julie, asterisk, how's the new place? Haunted yet? Asterisk." I smirked and typed back. "Me, asterisk, not yet. Just creaky and old. Perfect for me, asterisk." I set the phone down and sipped my beer, letting the quiet settle around me. It wasn't so bad, really. Sure, the place needed some work, but it had potential. Then I heard it, a soft thump, like something falling over upstairs. I froze, the beer bottle halfway to my lips. My first thought was that I'd forgotten to close a window, and the wind had knocked something over. But then another thump followed, louder this time. My chest tightened. "Hello," I called out, feeling foolish. The house replied with silence. I grabbed the flashlight from the pile of tools by the door and headed upstairs. The wooden staircase groaned with each step, and I cursed myself for watching so many horror movies. At the top, the hallway stretched out to my left and right, lined with closed doors. "Anybody here?" I tried again, my voice firmer this time. Nothing. I checked each room, my flashlight beam slicing through the gloom. The first was empty except for some old curtains that swayed slightly in the breeze from a cracked window. The second was a bathroom, the sink stained yellow with age. The third room was the master bedroom, my bedroom. The noise had come from here. I was sure of it, but nothing seemed out of place. I scanned the room, the flashlight flickering as I moved it. The bed frame I put together earlier stood in the center of the room, my suitcase beside it. I was about to leave when the closet door creaked open. The closet door inched open, the sound a slow, aching groan that made my skin prickle. I stopped breathing, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand as I aimed it toward the dark sliver inside. "Hello," I said again, barely above a whisper. No answer. I took a step closer, the old floorboards creaking beneath me. The gap widened, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. My heart thudded in my chest as I nudged the door open all the way with the toe of my boot. Empty, just a shallow space with a single wooden rod for hanging clothes and a dusty floor. I let out a shaky laugh and ran a hand through my hair. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, clicking off the flashlight. "It's just an old house. Old houses make noise." The door creaked again, but this time it was because I was closing it. I gave it an extra shove to make sure it latched properly, then headed back downstairs, my nerves still jangling. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though I kept glancing at the ceiling every time the house made the faintest sound. Eventually, I drifted off on the couch, the beer still sitting half-finished on the coffee table. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of birds chirping outside. The fear I'd felt the night before seemed ridiculous in the bright light of day. I made coffee, unpacked a few more boxes, and tried to settle into the house. Around midday, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find an older woman standing on the porch, a woven basket in her hands. Her hair was a cloud of white curls, and she wore a long cardigan despite the warm weather. "You must be the new tenant," she said, smiling. Her voice was warm, but there was something in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or wariness. "Yeah, that's me," I said, forcing a smile. "Thanks for stopping by. I'm..." "Evan," she interrupted. "I know. I'm Margaret. I live next door." She nodded toward the house on the left, partially obscured by overgrown hedges. "Brought you a little something to welcome you." She handed me the basket, which was filled with freshly baked muffins. "Wow! Thank you. That's really kind of you," I said, genuinely touched. Margaret lingered on the porch, her eyes drifting past me to the interior of the house. "Place looks good," she said after a moment. "A lot of folks have tried to fix it up over the years, but well, you know how old houses are." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly on the edge of her cardigan. "Oh, nothing really. Just, it's got a history, that's all." "History?" She glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one else was around, then leaned in slightly. "Strange things have happened here. Folks hear things, see things." She gave me a pointed look. "You be careful, Evan. Some houses don't like to be disturbed." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. "Well, I'll keep that in mind. Thanks again for the muffins." Margaret nodded and turned to leave, but she paused at the edge of the porch. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." As she walked away, I closed the door and set the basket on the counter. The encounter left me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. That night, I lay in bed, the events of the day replaying in my mind. Margaret's words stuck with me, though I tried to brush them off as the ramblings of a superstitious neighbor. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and the old house groaned in response. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, staring at the ceiling. Then it started again. Thump. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from the hallway outside my room. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking. Silence. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, fumbling to switch it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was icy cold under my feet. The thump came again, louder this time. It was closer. The thump echoed through the hallway, heavy and deliberate, as if someone or something was testing the floorboards just outside my door. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Who's there?" I forced out, my voice trembling. No response. The silence pressed against me, thick and suffocating. My eyes darted to the bedroom door. It was closed, but now I couldn't remember if I had locked it. Slowly, I rose from the bed, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. The flashlight's beam trembled as I aimed it at the door. "This isn't funny," I called, trying to sound firm. "If someone's messing with me, you're about to regret it." Still nothing. I took a step forward, every instinct in my body screaming to stay put, to let whatever was out there remain unknown. But something in me, curiosity or sheer stubbornness, propelled me forward. My hand closed around the doorknob, cold and slick with condensation. I twisted it slowly, the mechanism clicking loudly in the stillness. The hallway was empty. I swept the flashlight back and forth, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and uneven floorboards. Everything was exactly as it had been earlier, except for the footprints. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but the beam of light caught them, dark, damp impressions on the wooden floor. Bare feet. They led from the far end of the hallway to my door, stopping just short of it. My stomach twisted. "No way," I whispered, backing into the room and shutting the door. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. It had to be a leak or some kind of condensation, I told myself. The house was old. Water could be seeping through somewhere, creating patterns that just looked like footprints. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The next day, I went to Margaret's house. I didn't plan to bring up the footprints. I wasn't ready to admit to anyone, not even myself, that something unnatural might be happening. But I needed to know more about the house. Margaret answered the door almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting for me. "Evan," she said, her tone wary but kind. "Come in." Her home was the polar opposite of mine, bright and cozy, with neatly arranged furniture and the smell of baked bread lingering in the air. I sat on her floral-patterned couch while she poured tea. "So," she began, setting a cup in front of me. "What brings you over?" I hesitated, trying to find the right words. I want to know more about my place. You said it had a history." Margaret's expression darkened, and she set her teacup down without drinking from it. "I was afraid you'd ask," she said. "Most folks don't want to know. They'd rather pretend everything's fine until it isn't." "What do you mean?" I pressed. She sighed and leaned back in her chair. "That house, it's been trouble for as long as I can remember. People don't stay there long. Some leave after a few months, others after just a few days." "Why?" Margaret hesitated, then said, "It's cursed." I blinked at her, unsure whether to laugh or run. "Curse?" She nodded, her face grim. "Back in the early 1900s, it belonged to a man named Harold Graves. He was a recluse, kept to himself mostly, but the rumors started after his wife disappeared. What happened to her? No one knows. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. Harold told the neighbors she'd left him, but people didn't believe him. They said they'd hear strange noises at night, chanting, sometimes screams. A chill ran down my spine. Harold was obsessed with the occult, Margaret continued. He believed he could speak to the dead, that he could summon things. She paused, her eyes narrowing. The last time anyone saw him, he was running through the streets, babbling about how he'd opened a door he couldn't close. He vanished after that. Some say he went mad and killed himself. Others think whatever he summoned took him. My throat was dry. And the house? Margaret's gaze hardened. It hasn't been right since. People hear things, footsteps, voices. Some see shadows that move on their own. And some, she trailed off, her expression haunted. Some what? I asked, leaning forward. Some don't make it out at all. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Harold Graves and the so-called curse. I told myself it was nonsense, a ghost story meant to scare newcomers. but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I stayed up late, sitting on the couch with a beer and scrolling through my phone, searching for any information about Harold Graves or the house. Around midnight, I heard it again. Thump. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The sound was coming from the kitchen this time. I set the beer down and grabbed a flashlight. My heart pounded as I crept toward the kitchen, the beam of light bouncing unsteadily with each step. When I reached the doorway, I stopped cold. The kitchen chairs had been pulled away from the table, arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of the floor. And in the center of the circle, scrawled in dark, wet streaks, was a symbol I didn't recognize. I stood frozen in the doorway, the beam of my flashlight quivering as I stared at the symbol. It was drawn hastily, as if in a rush, with dark streaks of what looked like blood. My stomach twisted. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sight of it. The symbol was crude, a series of intersecting lines that formed an irregular circle with jagged edges. My mind raced, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't recall seeing anything like it before. It looked ancient, unnatural. I took a step forward, and the floor creaked beneath me. I felt as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The chairs, too, seemed out of place, arranged so perfectly in that strange, deliberate circle. I glanced around the kitchen, the familiar appliances now looking foreign in the dim light. My gaze flicked to the doorway, half expecting someone to appear, but there was only darkness behind me. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the symbol. There was no rational explanation for it. There couldn't be. I turned and ran, nearly tripping over the threshold as I darted back into the living room. My pulse throbbed in my temples, and my breath came in ragged gasps. My mind raced, trying to put together the pieces, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I should call someone. I should leave. But as the thought of leaving crossed my mind, I felt something cold sweep through me, a chill that settled into my bones, and suddenly, I couldn't bear the idea of going anywhere. I sank down onto the couch, staring at the floor as I tried to steady my breathing. The house groaned around me, the wind howling outside, and yet it felt still, dead still. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to go into the kitchen. I had no idea what I'd find there, and I was terrified that the symbol would still be there, mocking me with its sinister presence. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called Margaret. My fingers shook as I dialed her number, and when she picked up, her voice was a soft, almost reluctant greeting. "Margaret, it's Evan." I hesitated, then added, I need to talk to you about the house." There was a long pause on the other end. I could practically hear her weighing whether or not to say what I needed to hear. "Come by in an hour," she finally said. "I'll explain everything." I arrived at Margaret's house feeling both relieved and uneasy. I had so many questions that I knew she had answers to, but I wasn't sure I was ready to hear them. Margaret greeted me at the door, her face as serious as I'd ever seen it. She led me to the kitchen, where a large, old-fashioned book sat on the table, its cover worn and weathered. "This is Harold Graves' journal," she said quietly, her hands resting on the worn leather cover. "I was going to show you sooner, but I didn't want to scare you off. I see now I should have told you sooner." I nodded, swallowing hard. "You said he was into the occult." Margaret nodded grimly. "He wasn't just into it. He was obsessed. He believed he could contact the dead, bring them back." She gestured to the journal. "This is where he wrote down his rituals, his experiments. It's all in there." I reached for the journal, my fingers trembling as I touched the edges of the leather. When I opened it, the pages were filled with cramped, frantic handwriting, along with sketches of strange symbols and diagrams that looked like nothing I had ever seen before. As I flipped through the pages, one entry caught my eye. Asterisk, "The doors open. They are here, watching, waiting. I have made the mistake I cannot undo. They follow me now. I can hear them at night, in the walls. The house is theirs. Asterisk. I shuddered, the words seeming to come alive in my mind. I quickly flipped the page, but another entry jumped out at me. Asterisk, they are closer. I feel them behind the walls. I cannot sleep. I cannot stop hearing their voices. The ritual must be completed. Only then will I be free. Asterisk, I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding in my chest. Margaret watched me carefully. That's what I was afraid of. Harold, he did something in that house, Evan. Something that shouldn't have been done. And now it's too late to stop it. What do you mean? I whispered. What happened to him? Margaret's face darkened. I told you. People saw him running through the streets raving. He was babbling about something in the walls, something waiting for him. I think he opened a doorway to something that's not supposed to be in this world. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. I thought of the symbol in the kitchen, of the strange noises at night, of the footprints. Was this all tied to that door? To whatever Harold had let in? I stood up suddenly. I need to go back, I said, my voice tight. Margaret's eyes widened. No, don't. You don't know what you're dealing with. I have to. I turned toward the door. I have to see if I can stop it before it's too late. The air outside had grown heavy, the sky overcast as if the world itself were holding its breath. I walked back to the house with a sense of dread pooling in my stomach, but I couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake, too much I didn't understand. I needed to figure out what Harold Graves had done, and if possible, stop it. I stood in front of the house, the windows dark and vacant, watching me like hollow eyes. The same heavy silence hung around it, thick and suffocating. Every instinct screamed for me to turn around, but I couldn't. I entered through the front door, which creaked ominously as it swung open, the familiar smell of dampness and decay greeting me. The house felt colder now, more oppressive. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something in the air, something darker. I moved quickly through the entryway and into the living room, my footsteps muffled by the thick dust that seemed to cover everything. My mind kept returning to the symbol, the strange ritual Harold had been attempting. There had to be something in his journal that could explain how to undo it, how to close the door he had opened. I made my way to the kitchen. The chairs were still arranged in a perfect circle, the symbol still scrawled in blood, though the red stains now seemed darker, as if they were freshening with each passing moment. I swallowed hard, fighting the rising panic, and grabbed a rag from the counter to wipe away the blood. The fabric felt sticky, clinging to my hand, but I kept going, scrubbing at the symbol with frantic energy. Nothing. The more I wiped, the more the symbol seemed to bleed into the wood, as though it were part of the house itself. My heart raced as I realized the impossible truth. This wasn't something I could just erase. Get a grip, Evan, I muttered to myself, but my voice was shaky, my hands trembling as I stood back and surveyed the room. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from behind the walls. At first, it was subtle, just a faint rattle, almost like the sound of pipes shifting. But then it grew louder, a rapid, incessant tapping, as though something was trying to break through. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as I listened, my blood turning to ice. The sound wasn't coming from the pipes. It was coming from the walls themselves. The house groaned beneath the noise. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The air around me turned frigid, and I could see my breath puffing out in white clouds, though the house had never been this cold before. My fingers were numb, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The tapping intensified. I turned to the wall, my mind racing. There was no logical explanation. It wasn't possible, but the noise was undeniable. Something was in there. I stepped forward, the flashlight flickering as I shone it on the wall closest to the noise. The wood was aged, splintered, but there was no sign of a hole or a crack. I reached out to touch the wall, my hand trembling. As soon as my fingers brushed the surface, The tapping stopped. I yanked my hand back, gasping. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It shifted in the darkness beyond the hallway, moving impossibly fast, as if something or someone was just out of sight, watching me. I turned my head sharply, but it was gone. My breath hitched in my throat. I backed away from the wall, my pulse a drumbeat in my ears. The sense of being watched intensified, pressing down on me from every direction. The footsteps began, heavy, slow. They moved down the hallway, dragging across the floor with a sickening scrape, as though something was being dragged. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing in the empty space. I grabbed the flashlight again, the beam shaking as I turned toward the sound. Nothing, only darkness. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Too loud, too frantic. My hands were slick with sweat, and I could feel the cold creeping up my spine. But I couldn't run. I couldn't leave. I had to finish what I started. I turned toward the staircase. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, each step echoing through the house like a warning. The sound of my heartbeat thudded in my ears, and every instinct told me to turn back, to leave this cursed house behind. But I couldn't. The shadows at the top of the stairs seemed to call me, pulling me forward. The moment I reached the landing, I knew I had made a mistake. The air up here was thick, heavier than downstairs, and it tasted stale, like something had been trapped in this room for too long. The hallway stretched in front of me, darkened and unnervingly still. The doors to the bedrooms were closed, their outlines indistinct in the dim light. But there was something about the way the air felt, an oppressive weight pressing down from all directions. I moved toward the first door, the room that had always felt just slightly off. The door opened with a reluctant groan, and I stepped inside. The room was small, bare except for a moth-eaten rug and an old dresser. The window was open, the curtains billowing in the breeze. The light from the flashlight swept across the room, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. Then I saw it. On the far wall, a mirror. The glass was cracked, the edges jagged like a spider's web. But what made my stomach drop wasn't the damage. It was a reflection. In the mirror, there was someone standing behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. But the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and there it was again, asterisk a figure asterisk, standing just beyond the edge of the frame, half obscured by the shadows. It wasn't a person I recognized, but it was unmistakably human. I backed away slowly, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I glanced around the room. I was alone, but the reflection remained. Asterisk, it was still their star. The figure moved closer. It was a woman, tall and thin, her features sharp and gaunt. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with something indescribable, a kind of emptiness. I felt a coldness spreading over me, like something was pressing against my chest, suffocating me. The room seemed to close in. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then I heard her voice. Asterisk, leave, asterisk. It was a whisper, soft at first, but it grew louder with each word. I could feel her breath in my ear, even though she wasn't anywhere near me. Asterisk, leave. Asterisk. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. I turned to run, but as I did, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, slow, and they were coming toward me. I bolted out of the room, my breath ragged and panic setting in. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the presence behind me, closing in, pushing me. The footsteps grew louder, more pronounced, as if someone was chasing me. I made it to the staircase, nearly tripping on the last step as I scrambled down. As soon as my feet hit the bottom floor, I froze. The door to the living room was ajar, and I could see the light from the kitchen flickering through the crack. There, in the doorway, stood the same shadowy figure from the mirror, her gaunt face staring at me with hollow eyes. I was paralyzed, but then something snapped in me, a primal survival instinct that pushed me to act. I ran. I sprinted toward the door, not caring if the thing behind me followed or not. I reached for the knob, but it wouldn't turn. My hand shook, slipping, as I twisted and yanked at it. The shadow moved closer. I screamed, throwing my body against the door with all my strength. Finally, it opened, and I burst outside into the night air. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, engine roaring to life, tires screeching as I sped away from the house. I didn't look back, but even as I drove, the coldness stayed with me. I could still feel her watching, her eyes burrowing into the back of my skull. I wasn't free. Not yet. I couldn't shake the feeling. Even as I sped away from the house, my heart still pounding with fear, it felt like the darkness had followed me. The shadow, the footsteps, the whispering voice. It all replayed in my mind like a loop, haunting every corner of my thoughts. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was it real? Was it just my mind unraveling under the pressure of what I had discovered? But deep down, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't done. I couldn't be. I spent the next few days in a fog, barely sleeping, my mind constantly going back to the house. I had tried to push it all away, told myself it was nothing more than a bad dream, a trick of the mind, but I knew better. The figure in the mirror, the tapping in the walls, the cold, it had all been too real, too vivid. Margaret had been calling, but I ignored her messages. What could she say to make this better? How could anyone explain what had happened? But then, a week later, as I sat in my apartment, the phone rang again. This time I answered. Evan? Margaret's voice was tight, strained. I've been trying to reach you. I've been busy. I lied, though I hadn't been. I've been thinking about the house, about the things I'd seen, about what it was doing to me. I know what you're thinking, she said softly, her tone urgent. I've been digging into the house's history. You can't just walk away from this. I froze. What do you mean? There's more, Margaret continued. The house wasn't just Harold Graves' obsession. The history goes back further, much further. The land it was built on, it has a dark past. There were rumors about the original owner, a man named Thomas Blackwood. They say he was a sorcerer of sorts, an occultist who built the house for his experiments. My stomach churned. I had a feeling where this was going. Thomas Blackwood, I repeated. What happened to him? Margaret hesitated. No one knows. Some say he vanished. Others say he was taken by what he called the other side, the thing Harold Graves was trying to summon. It's been there for generations, Evan. It's tied to the land, to the house. I could feel the blood draining from my face. So this thing, it's been here all along? Margaret's voice lowered. Yes, and you're not the first to try to leave. The house has a way of keeping people. Once you step foot in it, once you learn too much about it, it doesn't let you go. I shivered, remembering the cold, the figure in the mirror, the voice whispering in my ear. You need to go back, Margaret said urgently. There's something in that house that's still unfinished. You can't just walk away from this. It won't let you, but you can stop it. You have to destroy the door Harold opened. It's the only way. I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream that I had already left. I wasn't going back to that place, but the words died on my tongue. Deep down, I knew Margaret was right. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the map Margaret had sent me, an old layout of the house. The floor plans were marked with odd symbols, lines crossing through rooms, and arrows pointing toward the basement. The basement. I hadn't even thought about it. It was there, beneath the house, that I knew I would find the heart of whatever was lurking inside. The doorway that Harold had opened, the one that had followed me, the one that now had a hold of me. It was waiting for me, and there was no way out until it was destroyed. The next morning, I drove back to the house. My hands were steady on the wheel, but inside, I was shaking. I could still hear the echoes of those footsteps, still feel the coldness creeping under my skin. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to face what I knew awaited me, but I had no choice. As I pulled up to the house, everything felt wrong. The air was thick, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting. It loomed there in front of me, dark and foreboding, a prison built from the earth itself. I stepped out of the car, the ground cold beneath my feet, and approached the front door. It creaked open as I touched it, almost welcoming me back. The house felt alive, but this time I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I was going to destroy it. I walked through the house, every step heavy with purpose. The living room was dark, the smell of dampness clinging to the air. I passed through the kitchen, the chairs still in their circle, the symbol still drawn in the bloodstained wood. But I didn't stop. I kept moving through the hall toward the stairs. The house groaned around me, like it was trying to push me away, to stop me from reaching my goal. But I didn't listen. I reached the basement door, and I opened it. The basement door creaked open, and a gust of cold air rushed up from below, sending a shiver down my spine. I hesitated for only a moment, staring into the darkness that stretched below me. There was something down there, something ancient, something waiting. The flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam cutting through the blackness. But the farther down the stairs I went, the less light I seemed to have. The air grew thicker with each step, suffocating, as if the house was drawing in a deep, slow breath. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood for a moment, my pulse thundering in my ears. The basement was vast, its stone walls damp and crumbling, but at the far end, there was something that caught my eye, a large old wooden door twisted and warped with age. The same door Margaret had mentioned, the door Harold Graves had opened. I took a step forward, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. As I got closer, the temperature seemed to drop even more, the cold sinking into my skin, biting deep. The door was covered in strange markings, symbols I recognized from the journal. Harold had tried to unlock something here, something that shouldn't be opened. I reached out for the door handle, my breath misting in the frigid air. My fingers brushed against it, and a sharp jolt of energy shot up my arm. It was like a pulse, alive, crackling. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to pull my hand away, but the door seemed to pull me closer, as though it had a hold on me, something invisible, something pulling from the other side. I forced myself to grip the handle, yanking it open with all my strength. The door groaned in protest, but it gave way, revealing a narrow, pitch-black hallway that stretched into oblivion. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, and I could feel the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing in on me. I stepped forward. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before me, its walls lined with old, faded portraits, their faces obscured by years of grime. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with some dark energy. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint but clear, coming from somewhere ahead. It was a voice, but it wasn't human. It was ancient. Leave, before it's too late. I froze. The voice sent a chill through me, crawling under my skin, and I knew. Asterisk, I was not a lone star. I tried to steady my breathing, but it was impossible. The air was thick with something that wasn't just cold. It was malevolent. It was hungry. I moved forward slowly, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The flashlight flickered in my hand, its beam barely illuminating the path before me. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they felt like a dozen voices whispering at once. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come. Asterisk, asterisk, it's too late. Asterisk. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing down. The floorboards beneath my feet creaked and groaned as if the house was alive, shifting with every step I took. The cold air seemed to seep deeper into my bones, until I could hardly move, hardly breathe. I pushed on, driven by something I couldn't explain, I had to get to the end of this. I had to destroy what was here, even if it killed me. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, there was a room, large and cavernous, the ceiling lost in darkness. And in the center of the room was something that made my blood run cold. A stone altar, covered in old symbols and bloodstains, sat in the middle of the floor. Around it were strange objects, bones, ancient candles, ritualistic tools, all arranged in a pattern I didn't understand. But it was a figure standing by the altar that stole my breath. It wasn't human. It was something else. A silhouette, tall and twisted, its form undulating in the dim light like smoke. Its face was hidden, obscured by shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, staring through the darkness, watching with an intelligence that was far beyond anything human. The whispers grew louder, until they felt like a scream in my head. Asterisk, it's too late. You're too late, asterisk. I tried to move, to step back, but my body was frozen. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The figure started to move toward me, its form shifting and bending, growing larger with each step it took. I reached for the journal, clutched tightly in my hands. The words were there, buried within those pages, a way to stop this, a way to destroy the door, to sever the connection to whatever was waiting on the other side. But as I read the words aloud, the figure paused. It was listening. Asterisk, you cannot stop it. Asterisk, the voice rumbled deep within my mind, vibrating through my skull. I felt its presence all around me now, suffocating, overwhelming. The temperature plummeted even further, until I could feel the ice creeping into my lungs, my fingers numb and stiff. I was going to die here, but I had no choice. I reached for the ritual knife, trembling as I held it in my hands. The figure advanced, its movements fluid and unnatural. I whispered the final words of the incantation, my voice barely audible. Asterisk, by blood and flame, I bind thee. By earth and stone, I seal thee. By the light of the sun, I cast thee out. Asterisk, a burst of light exploded from the altar, blinding in its intensity. The figure screeched, a sound like the tearing of metal, as if the world itself was being ripped apart. The walls trembled, the ground shaking beneath my feet, and then silence. I opened my eyes. The room was still. The figure was gone. The darkness receded. The house was quiet. I had done it. I had stopped it. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, a numbness creeping over every muscle, every bone. The silence was deafening, almost suffocating. The light from the altar still burned in my mind, the memory of its blinding flash lingering like an afterimage in my vision. The house, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, seemed at peace, unnaturally still. But that didn't mean it was over. I stumbled back toward the stairs, the weight of what I had just done pressing down on me. The flashlight was still clutched tightly in my hand, its beam barely illuminating the pitch-black hallway ahead of me. But I didn't need the light anymore. I could feel the change. The air was lighter, less oppressive, but it was wrong. The house had shifted, yes, but something was still lingering, something old and unfathomable. The basement door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, breath catching in my throat. The house groaned in protest, the walls shaking, as if it were struggling to keep me in its grip. I didn't have time to think. I ran. I rushed up the stairs, my feet pounding against the creaking wood. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I made my way back through the kitchen, past the blood-stained chairs, through the living room where the symbol still faintly glowed, and toward the front door. I reached the threshold, my hand trembling as I gripped the doorknob. But when I turned it, the door wouldn't open. I twisted harder, panic rising in my chest. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, the sensation of being trapped crawling over me, suffocating me. The door of the house, it wasn't letting me leave. It had never let anyone leave. I yanked the door with all my strength, and just as I thought I might break the handle, the door suddenly gave way. The moment I stepped outside, the air felt like it had a different texture, thicker, cleaner. But the sense of dread didn't leave. It followed me. I had escaped the house, yes. But had I truly escaped? I stood in the yard, staring at the house from a distance. It loomed over me like a dark, malignant presence. The windows were empty eyes, the door a gaping mouth, waiting to swallow anyone foolish enough to approach. The chill in the air lingered on my skin, like the house was still watching, waiting for me to come back, waiting for its next victim. I didn't know how long I stood there. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror. What had I unleashed? Had I truly destroyed the curse? Or had I just made it wait longer? I tried to leave, but the road felt endless. The trees blurred past me, the world outside the house twisting and shifting, like it was just another extension of the house's influence. My eyes would dart back to the rear-view mirror, expecting to see it. Asterisk the house, asterisk, the figure in the window, the shadows moving behind the walls. But it was always empty. I wanted to believe I was free. I wanted to believe the nightmare was over, but I knew better. 2 months later, I found myself standing at the edge of a new town, looking at a new place, another house. This one, different from the last. Smaller, quieter, less imposing. The kind of place that should have felt like a fresh start. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Just like the last one, I stepped inside, the door creaking slightly as it shut behind me. And then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps overhead. Not mine. The house groaned, the walls whispered, and the cold swept through the rooms. The unmistakable feeling of something alive. The same house, the same curse. I wasn't free, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. It wasn't the same house. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself. This one was different. It had to be. But every creak, every whisper, every chill in the air reminded me of the nightmare I had just escaped. The footsteps above me, the sounds of movement in the walls, were all too familiar. The house had a way of making its presence known, seeping into the cracks of your mind until you couldn't tell where the house ended and your own fear began. I couldn't stay here. I knew I couldn't, but something in me, some deep, twisted part of me, couldn't leave. It wasn't the same as last time. The house was smaller, more modest. The walls were thinner, the floorboards less worn. The air didn't feel as heavy, but I felt it, the same coldness, the same oppressive weight pressing down on me. I thought I'd gotten away from it. I thought I had escaped, that the curse was broken, that the door had been sealed. But that was a lie. It had never been sealed. It had never truly been stopped. I was living in its shadow. Days passed, and I fell into a routine, forcing myself to ignore the sensations, the whispers in the walls, the faint echo of footsteps, the way the temperature would drop in the middle of the night. I tried to pretend it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. The house was old, of course. Every house creaked. Every old building had its quirks. But I couldn't ignore it forever. One evening, while I was sitting at my kitchen table, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, soft, almost gentle. It whispered my name. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voice came again, closer this time. Evan, it was unmistakable. I bolted from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't believe it. I had barely had time to digest what had happened before the cold air hit me. A blast of icy wind that seemed to come from nowhere, swirling around me in the confined space of the kitchen. Evan, the voice was louder now, closer. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. The same figure. It wasn't human. I could feel it in every bone in my body, the wrongness of it, the unnatural shift in the air around it. Its form was flickering, shifting, like smoke or shadow, its shape never quite staying the same. But it had eyes, eyes that glowed in the darkness, watching me, seeing me. The room seemed to warp around it, the walls stretching, the floorboards buckling. Asterisk, you cannot run. You cannot hide. Asterisk, it spoke, and its voice was 1,000 whispers, 1,000 tortured souls all screaming in unison. I tried to move, tried to run, but my feet were frozen in place. The figure drifted toward me, moving with an unnatural, fluid grace. It reached out, its hand long and skeletal, its fingers curling toward me like claws. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the house, drowned out by the overwhelming presence of whatever was standing before me. Asterisk, you belong to us. Asterisk, I struggled to break free, to escape its grasp, but it was no use. It was stronger than anything I had ever known, stronger than fear, stronger than my will to fight. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The house was silent again. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably. What had just happened? Had it been real? Had I imagined it? But deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't escaped. The curse was still here, still hunting me, still waiting. I had never truly left. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I knew that now, more than ever, the presence in the walls, the eyes watching me from the shadows, it was all too much. But where could I go? I couldn't keep running. I had thought I'd found peace. I thought I could escape this nightmare, but I couldn't. The house was a part of me now. It had marked me, claimed me, and no matter where I went, it would follow. I packed my things hastily, throwing clothes and belongings into a bag, but my hands were shaking, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Was there anywhere safe anymore? I could feel the walls closing in, the air thick with something I couldn't escape, something dark and hungry. I had come to realize that the house wasn't just a house. It was a door, a portal to something far worse than I could ever understand. And it was calling me. I reached the front door, the threshold once again, my hand gripping the knob. But just as I was about to step outside, I heard it, soft, like a whisper in the wind. Asterisk, you'll never leave. Asterisk. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the house. The door shut behind me with a soft thud. The world outside was still, quiet. I looked back at the house, my breath caught in my throat. And for the first time, I realized it wasn't just a house. It was me. The curse had taken root, and I was its prisoner. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Not with the whispers in the walls. Not with the creeping chill that clung to every corner of the house. The figure from the kitchen, its eyes, its voice, haunted me in the silence of the night. Every creak, every groan of the house sent my heart racing, my nerves snapping. The house was alive in ways I couldn't comprehend, a thing that was part of me now, part of everything I was. But as the days dragged on, I couldn't deny the truth any longer. The house wasn't done with me. It wasn't just a building. It was a presence, and it was growing stronger. I tried to leave again. I packed my things, my heart racing with every passing second. But as soon as I stepped outside, something changed. The world around me twisted, the sky darkened, and the road ahead of me seemed to stretch on forever, leading nowhere. The house called to me, its grip tightening like a vice around my chest. I found myself back at the front door. The house had pulled me back in. It was inevitable. I had always been meant to return. I dropped my bag, trembling, as the door swung open on its own, inviting me in. There was no escaping it. There was no point in trying anymore. I stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind me with a thunderous bang. The air felt heavier here than it ever had before. The house seemed to breathe with me, like it was aware of my every thought, my every movement. And then I heard it, the voice, soft and soothing, whispering from the walls once again. Asterisk, welcome home. Asterisk. It was no longer a question. It was a statement. I felt it then, the presence behind me, looming, watching. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and there, standing in the hallway, was the figure once again. It was waiting. "You will never leave," it whispered. Asterisk, "You are ours." Asterisk, I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure stepped toward me, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel its touch on my skin, cold and suffocating. It reached for me, its long fingers brushing my face, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I was trapped. I had always been trapped. "You belong to us," it said, and this time its voice was final. There was no escape. I fell to my knees, my vision blurring, my body shaking uncontrollably. The house was alive, and it had claimed me as its own. And somewhere, deep inside, I knew I would never escape. Not in this lifetime. Not in the next. I had opened the door. I had broken the seal. And now, I was bound to it forever. The house waits, silent and still. The door, the threshold, the darkness, all of it remains. And when the next person arrives, drawn by the whispers or the hope of a fresh start, the house will greet them just as it greeted me. And they, too, will never leave. Story 2. I pulled up to the old house at the end of Maplewood Lane just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The place looked exactly like the online listing. 2 stories, peeling white paint, a porch with a single rocking chair, and a yard that had clearly seen better days. It wasn't the picturesque dream home most people would envision, but it was mine now. Cheap, quiet, and secluded. That was all I wanted. The moving van rattled to a stop behind me, its engine sputtering loudly before shutting off. I stepped out of my car and stood for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air. It smelled like damp earth, old wood, and a faint, acrid scent I couldn't quite place. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was different, like everything else about this new town. The movers began unloading my boxes while I wandered up the steps to the front door. The wood groaned under my weight, and the porch railing wobbled when I leaned on it. It had character, I told myself. That's what they always say about these old houses. The inside was just as I'd expected. Dated wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the hardwood floors were scuffed and uneven. The air was thick and musty, like no one had lived here for a long time. I flicked on the light in the foyer, and a single bulb flickered to life overhead. It cast a dim yellow glow that made the shadows in the corners look even darker. "Cozy," I said aloud, my voice echoing slightly. I wandered through the house, noting the quirks and flaws as I went. The kitchen sink dripped steadily. The stairs groaned underfoot, and one of the windows in the living room didn't quite shut all the way. Nothing I couldn't live with. I'd dealt with worse during my marriage. As the movers brought in the last of my furniture, I directed them to place everything in the designated rooms. The house felt bigger now, with my belongings scattered around, less like a hollow shell and more like a place I could actually live in. By the time they left, it was fully dark outside. I stood in the living room, looking out the front window at the empty street. A single street lamp flickered on and off, and I thought I saw movement in the shadows just beyond its reach. Probably a stray cat or a raccoon. Shaking off the creeping unease, I busied myself with unpacking. Hours passed in a blur as I opened boxes, folded clothes, and arranged furniture. By the time I was ready to call it a night, the house felt a little less foreign. As I climbed the creaking staircase to the second floor, I noticed something odd. The air felt colder up here, sharper. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with closed doors. My bedroom was at the far end. The other rooms would remain empty for now, just storage, I figured. Still, the closed doors gave me an odd feeling, like I wasn't supposed to open them. I shook my head, laughing quietly to myself. "Get a grip," I muttered. "It's just an old house." In my bedroom, I unpacked the essentials: bedding, pajamas, and a lamp for the nightstand. The window overlooked the backyard, which was little more than an overgrown tangle of weeds and bushes. Beyond it, the woods stretched into the distance, dark and impenetrable. As I climbed into bed, the house groaned and settled around me. The faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, and I made a mental note to check if there was an old chimney or fireplace somewhere. I turned off the light and lay in the darkness, listening to the creaks and whispers of the house. It was just settling, I told myself. Just old wood and drafts. But as I drifted toward sleep, I thought I heard something else, a faint rhythmic sound. It almost sounded like footsteps. The next morning was quiet, too quiet. I woke up late, having slept poorly. The footsteps from the night before had kept me tossing and turning, but I convinced myself it was just the house settling. After all, it was old, and houses like this always made strange noises. I rubbed my eyes and threw on some clothes, deciding to take a walk around the neighborhood, maybe meet some of the locals. I needed to start feeling like I belonged here. I stepped out the front door, the wooden frame groaning under my weight. The cool morning air was a welcome change from the stale, musty scent inside. The street was lined with aging houses, but everything felt oddly deserted. There were no children playing outside, no cars parked in driveways. It was as though the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something. I took a slow walk down the street, trying to familiarize myself with the place. The houses all looked similar, old, weathered, with faded paint and sagging porches. I could hear the distant chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves, but that was it. No sound of life. As I walked, I spotted a woman sitting on her front porch, rocking slowly in a wooden chair. She had graying hair pulled back into a bun, and her eyes were hidden behind a pair of thick glasses. She watched me approach, and as I got closer, she offered a slow, deliberate smile. "Morning," she called, her voice raspy but kind. "Hi," I said, offering a small wave. "I'm the new neighbor. Just moved into 211 Maplewood." She nodded, her smile faltering just slightly. "I know. We don't get many newcomers around here." I couldn't tell if she was being friendly or cautious, but I smiled back. "Yeah, I'm still getting settled. It's a nice neighborhood." She chuckled softly, the sound carrying an odd, unsettling edge. "It's quiet, that's for sure, but quiet's not always a good thing." I tilted my head, unsure if she was trying to make a joke or something more. "What do you mean?" Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward in her chair, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You'll hear things. At night. Footsteps, maybe, or whispers." She glanced over her shoulder, as if checking for someone listening. "Happened to the last person who lived in that house. People say it's cursed." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to laugh it off. "I'm sure it's just a house settling. It's old, right?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She just stared at me, as if weighing my words. After a moment, she gave a tight-lipped smile and said, "People say the last person who lived there went mad. Ran out one night, babbling about curses and dark things in the walls." I swallowed hard, trying not to let my unease show. "That sounds intense, doesn't it?" she replied, her tone going soft. "That's why I wouldn't go near that house if I were you. Not unless you're looking for trouble." I nodded, backing away slightly. "Thanks for the heads up." The woman didn't respond, her eyes still fixed on me with a strange intensity. I hurried back to my house, my steps quickening as I tried to shake off the strange feeling creeping up my spine. As I walked back inside, I noticed something odd. The air felt cooler again. It wasn't just the outside chill creeping in, though. It felt almost like the house itself was exhaling, breathing in time with the creaks of the floorboards. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the words of my new neighbor kept swirling in my mind. Cursed, dark things in the walls. I told myself I was being silly. I didn't believe in curses or ghosts. But why had she seemed so sure? Why did it feel like there was more to her words than just idle gossip? I went inside and locked the door behind me, needing to feel some distance from whatever strange things a woman had said. I had more important things to focus on than whatever rumors this little town might be whispering about. But something told me deep down that I wasn't done hearing about the house's dark past. The next few days passed in a blur of routine. I unpacked the last of the boxes, cleaned out the kitchen cabinets, and arranged my books on the shelves. I tried to ignore the faint feeling that the house wasn't quite as empty as it seemed. Every time I passed a hallway or glanced into a room, the shadows seemed deeper, heavier. But I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the house's age playing tricks on me. I hadn't seen the neighbor again, but I kept my distance, preferring to stay inside and focus on settling in. The house needed a lot of work. Small repairs, a fresh coat of paint, maybe some new furniture to replace the outdated pieces. But none of that bothered me. It was just another project, another thing to do to fill the emptiness left by everything that had happened before I moved here. The house creaked at night. It always did. No matter where you were, old houses settled and they groaned under their weight. But there was something different about the sounds here. They weren't random. They felt deliberate, as if the house was trying to tell me something. Sometimes, I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of something scratching at the walls. I'd jump out of bed, only to find nothing there, just the quiet hum of a house that had been standing for decades. At first, I dismissed it. Houses have quirks, I told myself. A draft in the walls, a shift in the foundation, maybe a mouse in the walls. That's all it was. But then one night, something happened that made me stop and question everything. It was about 3 a.m. when I woke up, my body suddenly alert. My heart was pounding, as though I'd been jolted awake by something unseen. The air felt colder than usual, and I could see my breath in the dim light from the moon outside. For a moment, I didn't know where I was, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, measured. They echoed from downstairs. I lay frozen in bed, my mind racing. The rational part of me screamed that it was just the house again, settling. But the other part, the part that was starting to feel a little too aware, was convinced that whatever it was, it wasn't just the house. The footsteps grew louder, drawing nearer. I could hear them crossing the hallway, moving from room to room. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I forced myself out of bed, my legs trembling beneath me as I crept toward the door. The house was pitch dark, and I moved cautiously, my heart thudding in my chest. I knew I should have turned on the light, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself, whatever that meant. I reached the top of the stairs and peered down, trying to make out any movement in the hallway below. There was nothing, just silence. I waited, my ears straining for any sound. And then I heard it again, footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving slowly across the floor of the hallway downstairs. This time, they were closer. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, their slow rhythm unmistakable. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen in the dark, listening. The sound of footsteps turned into something else, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It was my name. I sucked in a breath, choking on the air as the whisper seemed to wrap around me. Come down, come down. I took a step back, my body moving against its own will. Something inside me was telling me to run, to leave, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The whispering ceased. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It felt heavier, more suffocating, like the air itself was thick with something I couldn't see, but could sense. I backed away from the stairs, feeling the floorboards creak beneath my feet. My heart was racing, and I stumbled back into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. The house was still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been downstairs was still there, just waiting, watching. I lay in bed wide awake for the rest of the night, my eyes darting to every creak and groan of the house. When the first rays of light broke through the curtains, I finally let myself close my eyes, exhausted. But sleep didn't come easily. I didn't tell anyone about the footsteps. It seemed too strange, too unreal. People would think I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. Maybe it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. There was something in the house with me. I spent the next day avoiding the downstairs hallway. I didn't care what kind of excuse I could come up with. I simply couldn't bring myself to go anywhere near the stairs. I worked from my home office, trying to focus on the paperwork I'd put off for too long. But every so often, I'd hear the soft creak of the floorboards below, a faint rustling as if someone were moving around just out of sight. I'd glance toward the hallway, heart racing, and tell myself it was nothing, just the house settling. But each time, the unease would tighten in my chest, a knot that refused to loosen. In the afternoon, I decided to take a walk. I needed to get out of the house, away from the tension that hung thick in the air. The sun was bright, and the town had an almost sleepy feel to it, a stark contrast to the chaos I felt inside. I walked aimlessly, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. That's when I saw her again, the neighbor. She was sitting on her porch, rocking in her chair, just like the first time. Her glasses were perched low on her nose, and she was watching me intently. I hesitated for a moment before walking over. The woman had a strange hold on me. Maybe it was the way she'd spoken about the house, or maybe it was just that feeling that there was something I wasn't being told. "Hey there," I said, try to sound casual, as I stopped at the foot of her porch steps. "Back again, are you?" she asked without missing a beat. I nodded, glancing down at the swing creaking beside her. "Yeah, just needed to stretch my legs. Thought I'd check in with you again." Her smile was slow, deliberate. "You're not the first person to ask me about that house. People always come around, looking for answers. About what exactly?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Her eyes seemed to darken for a moment. "About the sounds, the whispers, the things that happen at night." I shifted on my feet, the back of my neck prickling. "What kind of things?" She let out a deep sigh, rocking slowly. "People moving, thinking it's just an old house. They hear things at night, footsteps whispering, doors creaking. At first, they think it's nothing, just a house. But then they start seeing things. Shadows that don't belong, figures in the corner of their eyes, people in the halls when no one's there." I felt my stomach drop. "And then what happens?" "Sometimes they leave. Sometimes they break down, go mad. And sometimes—" She trailed off, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sometimes they never leave at all." I swallowed hard, trying to keep the creeping panic at bay. "Do you think it's haunted?" I asked, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. The woman looked at me for a long moment, as though considering my question carefully. Then her lips parted in a thin, knowing smile. "I think it's more than that." Before I could ask what she meant, she stood up and slowly walked inside, leaving me standing there on the sidewalk, the weight of her words sinking into my chest. I wanted to laugh it off, tell myself it was just local superstition, the kind of talk you'd hear in a small town where the only entertainment was gossip. But there was something about the way she said it, something that rattled me to my core. I turned back toward my house, walking briskly now. The sky was beginning to darken, and I could feel the familiar chill in the air again. As I walked through the front door, I couldn't shake the image of her eyes watching me from her porch, the way she had spoken of the house like she knew its secrets. I tried to distract myself by unpacking the last few boxes I'd left in the living room. But as I moved my things around, I felt it again, this constant pressure, a heavy weight in the air, like the house was holding its breath. The evening passed quietly, but when I finally climbed into bed, the feeling lingered. The whispers had started again, soft at first, almost imperceptible. I sat up, straining to listen. The house was so still, too still. Then, from somewhere down the hall, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, the cold plastic feeling like an anchor in my hand. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The house wasn't just old, it was alive, somehow. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear them crossing the floor of the hallway below, heading toward the stairs. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I should get up. I knew I should check, but my body refused to move, locked in place by a fear so deep I couldn't even name it. And then, right outside my door, there was a knock. One long, slow tap. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears. I tried to speak, but no words came. The knock sounded again, this time a little louder. I stood up shakily, my legs weak beneath me. Slowly, I crept toward the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe the wind, maybe nothing at all. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. There was no one there. The air felt colder than ever, and I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in the silence. I stepped back into the room, shutting the door behind me, and locked it. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door, but eventually I climbed back into bed, the weight of what had happened settling heavily on my chest. I wasn't alone in this house, and it wasn't just the house settling anymore. The next morning, I didn't feel much like getting out of bed. My mind kept replaying the events of the night. The footsteps, the knock on the door, the eerie silence that it followed. I tried to convince myself that I was just exhausted, that my nerves were getting the better of me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I spent the day trying to focus on normal tasks, unpacking, cleaning, settling in. But the house felt different now, as though it were watching me, waiting for me to figure something out. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every flicker of light felt charged with an unseen presence. I needed answers. That afternoon, I took a trip to the town library. It was a small, dusty place tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. The kind of library that smelled like old books and coffee. The librarian, a woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, greeted me when I walked in. She had a kindly smile, but her eyes seemed to linger on me a little too long, as if she knew something I didn't. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice soft but careful. I hesitated for a moment before answering. I just moved into the house at 211 Maplewood. I was wondering if you have any information about its history. The woman's smile faltered, just a fraction, but it was enough for me to notice. "The old house, you mean?" she asked, her tone turning almost wary. I nodded. "Yeah, I've heard strange things about it." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned and walked toward a row of dusty filing cabinets in the back of the room. I followed her, the floor creaking underfoot. She rifled through the drawers with surprising speed, pulling out an old leather-bound file. She handed it to me without a word. I opened the file slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile pages inside. The first document was a yellowed newspaper clipping. It was an article from decades ago, the headline reading, "Tragedy strikes at 211 Maplewood. Family found dead under mysterious circumstances." My stomach dropped as I read on. The article described a family, parents and 2 children, who had been found in the house under bizarre conditions. There were no signs of struggle, no clear cause of death. The bodies were discovered several days after their death. But what stood out was the description of the scene. The house had been locked from the inside, and strange symbols had been drawn on the walls in what appeared to be blood. The article didn't mention anything about curses, but it hinted at the possibility of a darker influence. The family had reportedly been secretive in the weeks leading up to their deaths, and rumors spread that the father, a reclusive man named Leonard Vance, had become obsessed with the occult. I turned the page, my fingers trembling. The next document was a journal entry. July 12, 1947. The ritual is almost complete. The house hums with energy now, alive in a way I've never felt before. The symbols are drawn, the candles are set, and soon the gate will be open. There's no turning back. I can feel them watching from the other side, waiting. I must complete this tonight. My heart raced as I read the chilling words. Whoever Leonard Vance was, he had been trying to summon something or someone into the house. And whatever he had done, whatever ritual he had performed, had clearly gone horribly wrong. I looked up at the librarian, my voice barely a whisper. Who was Leonard Vance? The woman seemed to hesitate before answering. He was a scholar, of sorts, a researcher into the occult. If you can believe it, he bought the house years ago, and rumors say he was trying to open a door to the unknown. A door he couldn't close. She paused, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if lost in thought. No one really knows what happened to him. Some say he died shortly after the family, but no one saw his body. And the house, well, it's been abandoned more times than I can count, but no one stays long. You can feel it, can't you? I nodded, my throat dry. I had felt it, deep in my bones, the presence that lingered in the shadows. The librarian continued, people think it's cursed, but I think it's more than that. Whatever was summoned into that house all those years ago, it's still there, and it's waiting for the next person to let it in. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I had come to the library seeking answers, but I hadn't expected the truth to be this dark. I closed the file, my mind racing. Thank you, I said, my voice shaky. I need to go. The librarian simply nodded, her eyes following me as I left the building. I walked back to my house in a daze, the words from the journal echoing in my mind. The gate will be open. The house hums with energy. Whatever Leonard Vance had done, it had left its mark on this place, and I was living in it. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house felt colder than usual, the silence too heavy, as though the walls themselves were closing in around me. I stood in the foyer, staring down the hallway toward the stairs, unsure of what to do next. Then I heard it again, a whisper, "Come down." It was faint but unmistakable. I froze, my pulse spiking. The whisper came from downstairs, from the very place where the footsteps had been. I didn't know what to do. The air around me felt charged, thick with something I couldn't understand. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I had to know. I walked toward the stairs, my feet heavy with each step. The air grew colder as I descended, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. There, in the center of the hallway, was a figure, a shadow, but it wasn't just a shadow. It was waiting. The figure stood motionless at the end of the hallway, bathed in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the curtains. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the old furniture or the shifting of the house. But as I stared at it, the air around me grew heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath. It wasn't the shape of a person. It was wrong. The edges of the shadow were too sharp, too defined, and it didn't belong. The figure's presence felt ancient, like something that had been waiting for centuries. My heart hammered in my chest, and every instinct I'd screamed for me to turn and run. But I couldn't move. The whispering continued, coming from all directions at once, swirling in my mind. Come closer. Come down. The voice was soft, but its command was undeniable. It felt like a pull, an invisible thread tugging me forward. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadow. It didn't shift, didn't move, but there was a weight to it, a presence that I could almost feel pressing in on me. It wasn't human, not in any way I understood. Who are you? My voice trembled, the words barely escaping my throat. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the shadow, a shape seemed to emerge, a figure, tall and thin, almost skeletal, with eyes that glowed faintly, red like coals smoldering in the dark. The eyes fixed on me, unblinking, and a coldness washed over me, freezing me in place. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something other, and it was looking at me like I was the only thing in the world. "Come down," the voice whispered again, this time clear, distinct. I took a step backward, my heart racing in my chest. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my legs wouldn't obey. They were locked in place, as if the floor had swallowed my feet whole. The figure took a slow step forward, the floor creaking under its weight. The whispering grew louder, an overwhelming cacophony of voices urging me to come closer, to step into the dark. But the fear, the deep primal fear, kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't understand what was happening. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something real, something that had been waiting. And then the figure spoke, its voice like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at it, frozen in terror. It took another step closer, and in that moment, the temperature in the hallway dropped sharply. I could see my breath, misting in front of me. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift around me, warping the hallway into something unfamiliar. The walls seemed to close in. The figure raised a hand, long fingers stretching toward me, and I felt an icy chill creep over my skin. The air buzzed, charged with energy, and the whispering became a roar inside my head. "Leave," the figure rasped, its voice now full of something ancient and cruel. "Leave before it's too late." I couldn't take it anymore. My legs finally moved, jerking me backward, but the air seemed to resist me, holding me in place. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was dry, constricted. The figure's eyes were locked on mine, and I knew deep down that it would not let me leave. Not unless it got what it wanted. I stumbled backward, my feet finally finding the strength to move, and I bolted for the stairs. But as I turned, I caught a glimpse of something else, something darker, more sinister, at the edge of my vision. It was as though the very shadows had come to life, reaching toward me with hungry fingers, clawing at the air. With a surge of adrenaline, I ran up the stairs, the whispering growing fainter with each step. But even as I reached the top, the presence, it was still with me. It had followed. I didn't stop until I was back in my bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. My body was trembling, and I felt like I was going to collapse. I pressed my back against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to gather my thoughts, to make sense of what had just happened, but my mind was a mess. The shadow, the figure, it couldn't be real. It couldn't be, but I had felt it. I had felt its cold fingers, its eyes boring into me. And now, as I sat there in the dark, my mind kept coming back to one thing, the journal. Leonard Vance. He had been trying to open something. He had been trying to summon something. And whatever it was still here. It was still waiting. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I didn't know how to stop it. But I knew one thing for certain. This house wasn't just haunted. It was a gateway. And I had just stepped through it. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter where I went, I knew deep down that it wasn't going to let me go. And I wasn't the first to feel its grip. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, barely able to sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper in the distance, made my heart race. The feeling of being watched, stalked, had never been so intense. Even in the dark, I could feel the presence of whatever it was, that thing in the shadows, just waiting for me to slip up. I didn't know if I could stay, but I also didn't know if I could leave. The house was alive. It had been so for decades, even longer, and something told me that even if I tried to escape, it would follow. The door was already opened. Whatever had been summoned into this place had its hooks in me, but I had to try. The next morning, I packed my things, what little I had. I couldn't waste any more time here. no matter how deeply the fear had burrowed into me. But before I could even consider leaving, I knew I had to do one thing. I had to understand what was happening. I needed answers. I decided to investigate the house further, digging deeper into its past. The shadow, that terrible thing that had spoken to me, wasn't going to let me go unless I knew exactly what it wanted. And what it was. I headed straight for the attic. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, the air growing thicker as I ascended. The attic had always given me an uneasy feeling, even before last night. It was dark and cramped, filled with the remnants of the past. The dust-covered furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and old trunks that hadn't been touched in decades. But it wasn't the mess that bothered me. It was the air. It was like the walls were breathing. The attic door creaked open with a low groan, and I stepped inside, immediately hit by the musty smell of old wood and damp fabric. The space was small, filled with cobwebs and broken furniture. There was a single window at the far end, its glass grimy, letting in just a faint trickle of light. I started sifting through the boxes and old trunks, trying to find anything that could help me make sense of what had happened to the house, to Leonard Vance. I didn't expect to find anything useful. After all, who would leave clues about an occult ritual in plain sight? But as I dug through a box of old books and papers, something caught my eye. It was a journal. The leather was cracked and weathered with age, its pages yellow and brittle. I pulled it from the box and blew off the dust, almost afraid to open it. But I had to know. I turned the pages carefully, scanning for anything that might make sense. The handwriting was scrawled messy, and the ink had faded over the years, but the words were still legible. January 23rd, 1927. The ritual is nearly complete. Tonight, I will open the door. I can feel the presence gathering, pressing against the walls of this house. It wants in, and I will give it what it seeks. The house is alive. It has always been alive. I have simply been its keeper, its servant. The others, my family, the people who lived here before, couldn't see it. They couldn't hear it. But I know what's waiting beyond. And tonight, I will bring it through. My heart skipped a beat as I read the chilling words. Leonard Vance had been obsessed with summoning something, a presence, and whatever it was, it had answered his call. I turned the page, more desperate to understand than ever. The next entry was dated just a few days later, January 27, 1927. It is done. The house is no longer just a house. It is a portal. The shadows are stronger now, and I can feel them pulling at me. They whisper in my ear, promise me things I have longed for. I have seen what waits on the other side. I have seen the door open, but I cannot control it. I have lost control. I felt a cold shiver creep over me as I read the words. The door Leonard had opened had not only brought something into the house, it had taken him as well. I flipped through more pages, searching for answers. There was an entry from just a few weeks before the tragedy, the day the family had been found dead. February 14th, 1927. They are here. They have come through. I can hear their voices, feel their cold hands. They will not leave. I tried to close the door, but it cannot be closed. The house has swallowed it whole, and now it will never be empty again. I am not safe. None of us are. The others, they do not know, but they will. They will know before the end. The words were chaotic now, scrawled in almost illegible script. The terror was palpable. Leonard had realized too late that he couldn't control what he had unleashed, and neither could anyone else who had come after him. I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. This was bigger than I had imagined. The house had always been a portal, a gateway to something darker, something ancient, and Leonard had made the fatal mistake of trying to control it. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. I had to get out of this place. I couldn't stay, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a strange marking on the wall. It was barely visible, hidden behind a pile of old blankets. I moved closer, my breath catching in my throat. The marking was the same symbol I had seen in the journal. Those dark, angular lines that seemed to shift in the shadows. The symbol was etched into the wall, like a warning, a reminder of what had happened here. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The house was alive, in a way I couldn't fully understand, and it was waiting for someone to open the door again. I had to leave. I had to get away from here before it was too late. But even as I turned to flee, I knew it wasn't over. The presence wasn't just in the house. It was in me now. And no matter where I went, it would follow. The door had already opened. I fled from the attic, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. The weight of what I had uncovered seemed to press down on me, heavier than the house itself. Leonard Vance's words echoed in my head, replaying over and over like a broken record. The door, the portal, the house. None of it made sense, and yet it all felt terrifyingly real. I couldn't stay any longer. I had to leave, no matter the cost. But as I made my way down the narrow hallway, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the living room, which I had left closed earlier, was now wide open. It hadn't been that way when I came upstairs. I was certain of it. The house didn't just settle. It was shifting, and it was waiting for me. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence in the house was suffocating, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt something pulling me forward. The living room was dim, the sunlight barely making it past the thick curtains. Everything looked as it had before, furniture in place, pictures on the walls. But something was wrong. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker, and the air felt heavy, as if it had been trapped here for years. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. My feet moved slowly, almost reluctantly, but I couldn't seem to stop them. The house wasn't going to let me leave that easily. As I walked toward the center of the room, I felt a chill in the air, the temperature dropping steadily. Goosebumps spread across my skin. My breath came out in visible puffs, like I was standing in the middle of winter, not a warm, sunlit afternoon. And then, from somewhere deep inside the house, I heard it, a low, scraping sound. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone was moving through the walls. I froze, my heart in my throat. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right next to me, as though the very walls of the house were alive and creeping toward me. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I could almost hear the house's heartbeat, slow, steady, like it was waiting for me to make a choice. I backed away, my legs unsteady, but my eyes remained locked on the center of the room. And then I saw it. The shadows seemed to bend and twist, coiling like living things, pulling together in the center of the room until they formed a figure. It was humanoid, but wrong, twisted, its shape flickering between solidity and shadow, like it couldn't decide whether it was real or not. It stood there, motionless, watching me with eyes that glowed red, faint but growing brighter by the second. The whispers that had haunted me since I first set foot in this place began again, growing louder, all around me, like 1,000 voices pushing into my mind. Come closer. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey me. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs were like stone, rooted to the floor. The figure in the center of the room seemed to pull me in, a gravity that was impossible to resist. The house felt alive, not just in its creaks and groans, but in its hunger. It wanted me. Suddenly, the figure jerked forward and I gasped, stumbling back in panic. The air grew frigid, my breath coming out in short, desperate bursts. The shadows lunged toward me, and I felt something cold wrap around my wrist, tugging me forward. I yanked my arm back, struggling to break free, but the grip tightened. Cold, clammy fingers dug into my skin, and I screamed, the sound lost in the oppressive silence of the house. The figure's face, if it could even be called that, twisted, the shadowy features warping in on themselves. It smiled, or at least, it looked like it was smiling, its jagged, toothless mouth stretching unnaturally wide. "Leave!" It whispered, its voice low and cracked, like the sound of dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Leave before we take you." I didn't know what it was, what it wanted, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay. I forced myself to move, my legs trembling, and with all the strength I had left, I broke free from the grip. The figure lunged at me again, its hands swiping through the air, but I darted toward the door. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get out. I ran down the hallway, past the stairs, and into the front door. But when I reached for the handle, something stopped me. The door wouldn't open. I tugged at it, panic rising in my chest. It was as if the house had sealed itself shut, locking me inside. I could feel it watching me from the other side of the door. The house had claimed me, and there was no way out. I stumbled backward, looking for another way out, but the house seemed to shift around me. The walls closed in, the hallways grew longer, and the rooms became distorted. I was lost, trapped. In the distance, I could hear it, the slow, rhythmic sound of footsteps. They were coming closer. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure? No! It was there, standing at the end of the hallway. Its red eyes glowed brighter now, like embers, and it moved toward me with unnatural speed. The whispering voices were louder than ever, a chorus of voices all calling my name, urging me to come. I could feel the pressure, the pull, tightening around me. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a living thing, hungry for my soul. And I was running out of time. The footsteps echoed in the house, louder now, growing faster as though something or someone was closing in on me with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my ears. The walls around me seemed to close in, pushing in on me, as if the house itself was alive and tightening its grip. I turned back to the door. It still wouldn't budge. My hands fumbled at the handle, desperate to escape, but it was as if the wood had fused to the frame, a part of the house that refused to let go. I tugged harder, panic beginning to tear through me. Behind me, the shadows shifted. I didn't need to look. I could feel it. I could feel it drawing nearer. I didn't dare turn to face it. I needed to get out. I backed away from the door, stumbling as I took a few steps back, my eyes darting around the room. The hallway beyond seemed to stretch out into an endless, distorted maze. Where had the front door gone? "It's all the same." The voice whispered again, cold and insistent. It was no longer just a figure, no longer just a shadow stalking me through the house. The house itself had become something else. I wasn't just trapped in a house. The house was trapping me inside my own mind. I turned and ran down the hallway, moving blindly, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Each step I took seemed to bring me deeper into a maze that twisted and writhed like a living thing. I thought I saw glimpses of windows, glimpses of sunlight, but every time I reached one, it was gone, swallowed up by the dark. I couldn't make sense of it anymore. The house wasn't just old. It wasn't just haunted. It was something else. It had been waiting, and now it was feeding off my fear, my confusion. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, beyond the shadows, was a door. Not the front door, the one that had been locked, but another door. Its wood was age-chipped, but there was something about it that called to me. It was familiar. It was the door from my dreams. My pulse quickened as I approached. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't stop myself. The door felt like it was pulling me toward it, and the closer I got, the more the air seemed to grow thick with dread. The whispers were louder now, the voices blending together in a maddening symphony. "Come closer. Open it. Don't run. It's waiting for you." I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, I felt it. An electric shock ran through my body. The door was alive, and it knew me. I hesitated. I should have turned around. I should have tried to run. But something about the door, something about what waited behind it, made me feel like I had no choice. I had to know. I pulled it open. The instant the door creaked wide, the room beyond seemed to pulse. The shadows inside it were darker, deeper than anything I had ever seen. It was as if the room was a part of the house that shouldn't exist, an extension of the nightmare that had gripped me ever since I moved in. But there was more. In the center of the room, illuminated by an unnatural glow, was a shape, a figure, and as I stepped closer, I saw it clearly. It was Leonard Vance. He was standing, but not in a natural way. His body was twisted, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me. The air was thick with his presence. I could feel the weight of his gaze, heavy and suffocating. But there was something else. He wasn't just standing there. He was waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Leonard's lips parted, and a voice, his voice, but not, slid out of him. You shouldn't have opened the door. I stumbled back, my mind trying to piece together what was happening, what I was seeing, but my thoughts felt like they were drowning in darkness. The figure before me began to move, slowly, mechanically, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. Its arms jerked unnaturally, and its head twitched. We are all here, it whispered. Its voice now a chorus of voices, waiting for you. And then the house shifted. The walls groaned. The floor beneath me cracked. The floorboards began to warp, and I heard the sound of something scraping beneath the house, moving toward me, toward us. Come inside, the voice urged again. It's too late to leave. You are part of us now. I turned and ran. I didn't know what had happened to Leonard Vance, but it didn't matter. Whatever he had done, whatever he had opened, it was now part of this house. Part of me. I reached the hallway, but it had changed again. The walls seemed to stretch and pull, leading me in circles. I couldn't remember the way out, but as I ran, I could hear it behind me. Footsteps, heavy, relentless. I couldn't outrun it. The door, the front door, it was still locked, still sealed. I turned to face whatever was coming. I couldn't escape. Not now. And then, in the silence that followed, I felt it. The touch. Cold fingers brushing against my skin, wrapping around my throat. The air grew even colder, freezing the blood in my veins. I gasped for breath, but the pressure only tightened. The house had claimed me, and there would be no escaping it. I gasped for air, but no breath came. My chest felt like it was being crushed under a weight I couldn't fight off. The cold fingers tightened, dragging me back toward the room with the door I had foolishly opened. I couldn't see the thing that had grabbed me, but I could feel it. Its presence was suffocating, like the house itself was pulling me into its dark heart. I kicked and twisted, trying to break free, but my body wouldn't obey. Every movement felt like I was swimming through thick, viscous air. The coldness, no, the hunger, surrounded me, filling my head with the terrible knowledge that this was it. This was the end. But then, in the instant before I thought I would lose consciousness, I heard something. A voice. It wasn't the whispers of the house, nor was it the sinister hum of the figure I had seen earlier. This voice was familiar. Strangely so. Get up. You have to get up. I blinked, my vision swimming. The voice felt like a memory, distant and hollow. But the words were clear. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if I was hallucinating. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. A spark will ignited, burning away the fog of panic that had clouded my thoughts. I fought harder, my body shaking as I pushed against the weight of the cold fingers wrapped around my throat. Then, another voice, stronger, more urgent. Get out! I broke free. The grip on me loosened just enough, and I was able to tear away from whatever invisible force had been holding me in place. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, choking but alive. For a moment, I couldn't move. My limbs were heavy, and my chest burned with the effort of sucking in breath. I couldn't think. I couldn't process what had just happened. The house was alive, and it was hunting me. But the voice hadn't been the only thing I had heard. The house was changing around me again, the walls groaning like they were alive, shifting with every heartbeat. It was pulling me deeper into itself, swallowing me whole. I forced myself up, stumbling to my feet. I couldn't stay here any longer. But even as I moved, I could hear the thumping footsteps growing louder with every second. The thing, the presence that had stalked me through the house, was coming closer. I ran. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the house itself was trying to drag me back. The hallway stretched out before me, longer, darker, more oppressive than ever. There were no windows, no doors, just the endless maze of rooms, each one twisting into the next, a labyrinth of despair. I reached the staircase, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. But just as I put my foot on the first step, I heard it. A sound so close, so real, it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. Don't go. The whisper wasn't soft. It wasn't distant. It was in my ear, clear and insistent. And the chill that followed it was so sharp. It felt like an ice pick jammed into my spine. I froze. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. It was there, waiting for me, watching me. You can't leave. It's already too late. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight, but I felt paralyzed, stuck in place by an invisible force. The house, it was feeding on my fear, drawing me deeper into its twisted embrace. But then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the voice again, the one that had called out before, the one that had saved me. Fight it. Don't listen to them. The voice was a lifeline. It was the only thing that felt real. I forced myself to move, taking one step, then another. My legs shook beneath me, but I had to get out. I bolted for the back door, my heart hammering in my chest. The house screamed in protest, the walls groaning, the floors buckling beneath my feet as I tore through the hallway. I reached the kitchen, empty and cold, the smell of decay heavy in the air. But the door to the backyard was right there, just a few steps away. It was open. I almost couldn't believe it. My heart raced with a mixture of fear and hope. The house was letting me go. I rushed toward it. I reached for the handle, and this time it gave. The door swung open with a soft creak, and fresh air hit my face. But as I stepped outside, my foot catching on the threshold, I heard it again. A sound from behind me, faint but unmistakable. The whispering. It was in the air now, swirling around me like a tangible force, a weight that pressed down on me from all directions. Don't leave. I turned, my heart seizing in my chest. But there was nothing in the doorway, nothing but the black, empty house behind me. The walls seemed to pulse and breathe, a living thing, and I could still hear the footsteps, the creaks, the voices all echoing inside my mind. The house wasn't letting go. I was free, but I was never free. The fear, the darkness, it had followed me out. I ran, stumbling down the overgrown path leading away from the house. I couldn't stop, not even for a second. I had to keep moving. I had to keep running. But as I looked back one last time, the house loomed over me, its windows dark, its door ajar, and I could swear, in the fading light of the day, that I saw a shadow moving behind one of the windows. Something was waiting, and no matter how far I ran, I knew I would never truly escape. The world outside felt different now, clearer, brighter. The air was crisp, free from the suffocating darkness that had been my constant companion inside that house. The farther I got from it, the more I could breathe, the less the weight on my chest seemed to press down. I ran for what felt like hours, my feet pounding against the dirt path, my breath ragged, but I didn't dare stop. I couldn't. I had to keep moving. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of the town. The streets were quiet, the houses around me empty, as though the world had stopped in time. I slowed down, gasping for breath, and glanced over my shoulder. I half expected to see the house standing there in the distance, watching me, but the road behind me was clear. I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness of the night settle over me. But even though the house wasn't visible, I could still feel it. The presence, the cold, the whispering. It wasn't gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only escaped for a short time, that it wasn't over. The voices lingered, echoing in the back of my mind. They hadn't stopped, not really. You can't escape. We will find you. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, trying to ignore the dread pooling in my stomach. But it was no use. I turned to the nearest house. There were people there, neighbors who had watched me leave, who could help me. I walked to the door, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them clear. I knocked, hesitantly, my hands trembling. The door opened. It was a woman, middle-aged, with dark circles under her eyes. Her face was drawn, weary, but when she saw me, she stepped back in surprise. You're back. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I just left. I trailed off. What was I even saying? She looked at me, her eyes flicking nervously toward the street. I don't think you should go back there, she said quietly, her voice trembling. I felt a chill wash over me. The house hadn't let me go. You knew. I whispered. You knew what it was, what it was doing. She nodded slowly, her gaze falling to the ground. You're not the first. People come, and they think they can escape. They think they can outrun it. But it's not that simple. I didn't understand. I couldn't. How could it have known? How could it follow me? The house, it calls to people, she said. It's not just a house itself. It's something older, something that's been here for years. I felt my stomach turn. What do you mean? What is it? She glanced nervously around again before stepping aside, letting me into the house. I didn't know why I stepped inside, but I did, driven by a mix of fear and desperation. She led me to the living room, her movements slow and deliberate. She sat down in an old armchair by the window and looked at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I was here when they first moved in, she said, her voice low, almost like a confession. I used to be friends with the Vances. My heart skipped. Leonard Vance. But that house, it's not just a house. It's like a door. It's tied to something. A presence. What kind of presence? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to summon the strength to continue. The house was built on old land, land where rituals were performed, dark ones. Before the Vances even arrived, there are things that live in those walls, things that feed on fear and regret. And Leonard, she stopped herself, her hand trembling. Leonard started digging. He wanted to know what was down there. He wanted to open it. Open it. My mind reeled as the realization hit me, like a blow. The rituals, the door, the thing in the shadows. Leonard didn't just move into that house. The woman continued. He awakened it. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. And now it's after me. Her eyes locked onto mine. It's after everyone. It doesn't let go. It never lets go. I stood up abruptly, panic rushing through me again. I can't stay here. I have to leave. It's still following me. It's in my head. No, she said, her voice strangely calm. You can't leave. You need to understand. The house won't let you go. You can run, but it will always find you. Always. I staggered back. What do you mean? I've been outside. It's gone. I'm not going back. Her gaze softened with pity. You were never truly outside. You were never free. You're part of it now. I took a step back, my body shaking with dread. And then, without warning, I heard it. The whispering. It was soft at first, like the wind rustling leaves, but then it grew louder, more insistent. My name. Come back. We're waiting. I felt the cold grip of fear tighten around me, as though it had just been lying in wait. No! I gasped, backing toward the door. I won't go back there. I won't. But it didn't matter. I was already too far gone. The walls began to close in on me again, the sound of footsteps growing louder with each passing second. The house was calling me, and no matter how fast I ran, I knew the truth now. I could never escape. I don't know how much time passed after the whispering began. The world felt distant, fractured, like I was trapped inside a waking dream, where everything was both too real and not real enough. The woman, the neighbor, she was still sitting there, her face pale and drained, her eyes watching me as I backed toward the door. But she didn't stop me. Maybe she knew, just like I did, that it wouldn't matter. I turned to leave, my heart racing, but just as my hand touched the doorframe, the whispering stopped, and for the briefest moment, I thought I might be free. But then, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I didn't have to look to know what it was. I could feel its presence, feel the suffocating cold press against me, like it was filling up my lungs. My throat closed as I turned slowly, dread crawling up my spine. There, standing just inches away, was Leonard Vance. His eyes were wide, his pupils so dilated they almost swallowed the whites of his eyes. His skin was pale, as if all the life had drained from it, leaving only an empty shell behind. But it wasn't just him. Behind him, the walls were shifting again, twisting, breathing, groaning with a low hum, as if the house itself was alive, feeding off the tension in the air. Leonard's lips parted, but no words came. Just a low, guttural sound, like a growl. And then, as if his body was no longer his own, he reached out, his hand jerking unnaturally toward me, his fingers clawing through the air. I stepped back, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst. I turned, almost running into the neighbor, her face now a mask of horror. "You can't escape," she whispered. The words were cold and final. I couldn't breathe. My head spun, and all I could hear was the sound of footsteps. Heavy, dragging, relentless. The house was pulling at me, its hunger a palpable thing. It wasn't just after me anymore. It was inside of me. "You're a part of it now." The voice echoed through the room, as if it came from the walls, the floors, the very air around me. I turned back to the door. It wasn't an escape. The door was just another part of the house, another way to trap me. There was no getting out, no way to leave. The house was everything now. I ran. I bolted through the front door, not caring if it was open or not, desperate to break free from the suffocating walls. The air outside was cold, but it was real. It was my last chance. I heard Leonard's voice, distorted and hollow, calling my name from behind me. It felt like it was coming from everywhere. I couldn't escape it. I ran into the street, my feet stumbling over uneven pavement, my chest heaving with exhaustion. The houses around me seemed to blur together, the world closing in. But as I ran, I felt something else, something pulling me back toward the house. It wasn't just the whispering. It wasn't just the footsteps. It was the hunger. I didn't know how far I had gone. The streets were all starting to look the same, each corner a repeat of the last. The houses, the trees, they were all a blur of motion. And then I looked up. The house. It was there. It shouldn't have been. I shouldn't have been able to see it. But there it was, looming over the town like a dark, silent sentinel. The windows black, empty. The door wide open. The house was waiting. I didn't want to go back. I couldn't. But as I turned to run in the opposite direction, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. I was back. It wasn't the same. The sky above was dark, the air thick with a strange heaviness, as if I was standing in some twisted reflection of the world I had known. The shadows were deeper here, colder, and the house, that godforsaken house, was right in front of me, like it had never been gone at all. I tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. I was trapped. It's already too late. The whisper came again, not from the house, but from inside my head. I backed away, my body shaking, but it was no use. I couldn't move. The house was calling to me, and no matter how far I ran, it would always be there. The door opened, and I knew deep down that I couldn't stop myself from walking through it. I turned, and for the first time, I walked back toward the house, my feet moving on their own, the cold air biting at my skin. There was no escape, and as I crossed the threshold, I realized the truth. The house had never been the prison. I had always been its prisoner. Story 3. I never thought I'd find myself here, unpacking boxes in a house older than my grandparents', in a town I'd never even heard of until 3 months ago. But life has a way of pushing you toward things you don't expect, especially after a divorce. After 13 years of marriage and a clean split, I needed a fresh start. Something quiet. Something far away from the memories that felt too heavy to carry anymore. The house was a steal. A 2-story Victorian with faded blue paint, a sagging front porch, and a turret that jutted up like a sentinel watching over the street. The realtor called it a fixer-upper with character. I called it affordable. The first time I stepped inside, it smelled faintly of mildew, like a basement that had been shut up too long. The wooden floors creaked under my sneakers, and the walls seemed to sigh as if relieved someone had returned. I liked the quirks. The way the staircase leaned slightly to the left, the old-fashioned light switches that clicked loudly when flipped, the stained glass window above the landing that cast strange, fractured rainbows onto the floor. It felt charming, at least at first. My new neighbors were curious but polite, though none lingered for small talk. They smiled and waved, a little too quickly, before heading back into their own lives. Except for one, an older woman named Marjorie who lived 2 houses down. She waddled over the day the movers unloaded my things, a casserole dish balanced on her broad hip. "You're braver than I am," she said as I accepted the dish. Her eyes darted to the house behind me. "What do you mean?" I asked, laughing nervously. "The paint job." Her face fell. "You really don't know?" I frowned. "Know what?" "The Crow House," she whispered. "People around here call it that. Built back in 1892 by a man named Thomas Crow. He was odd, kept to himself mostly. Folks said he dabbled in strange things, rituals and the like. After he died, no one stayed in the house for long. Too many strange stories. Too many incidents." I laughed awkwardly, thinking it was just some local legend or a case of small-town superstition. "What kind of incidents?" Marjorie lowered her voice, glancing around as if making sure no one could overhear. Footsteps when no one's there. Doors opening and closing on their own. A girl who rented it back in the 70s swore something sat on the edge of her bed every night. When she finally ran out of here, she was babbling about curses and shadows that followed her. Marjorie sighed. "I shouldn't be telling you this. I don't want to scare you off." I forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "It's probably just old house stuff, right? Drafty windows, creaky floors." Her gaze didn't waver. "Maybe. Just take care, dear." With that, she shuffled back down the street, leaving me with the casserole and a strange knot in my stomach. I turned back to the house, the shadows stretching long across the porch as the sun dipped lower in the sky. It was just a house, wood and nails and shingles. Whatever stories people told didn't matter. Still, as I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the air had grown colder. The first few days passed in a blur of boxes, tape, and half-hearted attempts at making the house feel like home. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the whole new start thing, but I was trying to stay positive. The house had a certain charm, with its creaky floors and windows that rattled when the wind blew. Every step I took seemed to provoke a groan or crack from the old wooden beams, but it felt real. I told myself that was a charm. The kitchen was the first room I tackled, trying to get it organized so I could at least have a proper meal. My hands were sore from lifting, and my head ached from the clutter. But the small act of unpacking felt grounding, like I was building something new from the chaos. That night, after a quick dinner of microwave soup, I sat on the couch, staring at the empty walls, wondering if I'd made a mistake. The silence of the house was both peaceful and unsettling. It was different from the white noise of my old life, different from the arguments, the awkward silences at dinner, the weight of everything hanging between me and my ex-wife. Now, it was just me and the house. As I sat there, I began to notice the noises. At first, I brushed them off, just the house settling, or so I told myself. But after a while, the sound became more distinct. A soft creak from upstairs, then a light scraping, like furniture being moved on the floor above me. I frowned, glancing up at the ceiling. It had to be the house settling. But then it happened again, the sound coming more frequently and with a strange rhythm, a thud, and then the dragging sound. I stood up, feeling the hairs on my neck rise. Probably just an old pipe, I muttered to myself, heading toward the staircase. Just an old house. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The sound came again, loud and insistent, thud thud, followed by a long scrape. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood frozen for a moment, staring up the dark staircase. I took a deep breath, forcing my feet to move. The wood creaked under my weight as I ascended slowly, each step echoing loudly through the house. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before me. The rooms lined up like dark eyes watching me from either side. I could feel the cold air of the upstairs, sharp against my skin. The scraping sound was closer now, coming from the door at the far end of the hall, the door to the attic. My breath hitched in my chest, and without thinking, I crept toward it, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached the attic door, my hand shaking as I touched the cold brass knob. For a moment I hesitated. Maybe it was just the house. Maybe it was the wind or a draft. I turned the knob and slowly pulled the door open, revealing the dim space beyond. The attic was barely illuminated by the faint light spilling from the hallway. The old wooden beams above looked as if they might collapse at any moment. The floor was littered with dust, cobwebs hanging in the corners. But there was nothing in the attic. Nothing except for the chill that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I exhaled slowly, my pulse returning to normal. I stepped back from the door, my foot hitting the floor with a hollow thud. "Just my mind playing tricks," I whispered, closing the door behind me. The days began to blur together after that night. I'd grown used to the house's oddities, the creaking floors, the strange noises that came at night. But something about the attic still lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I wasn't seeing, something I wasn't meant to understand. It was on the fourth day, while I was rummaging through the attic, looking for anything useful to unpack, that I found it. Tucked away behind a pile of old boxes and a dusty painting, there was a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and faded, the edges frayed as if it had been sitting there for decades, untouched. My curiosity got the best of me, and I pulled it out, brushing off the dust. I flipped it open to the first page. March 12th, 1892. The ritual begins today. The house will be mine. I will unlock the door that lies beyond. I blinked, reading the words again, my throat tightening. The handwriting was messy, frantic, as if the writer had been in a hurry, and the mention of a ritual didn't sit well with me. I flipped to the next page. April 3rd, 1892. The house is shifting. I hear footsteps at night, as if something is moving through the walls. They're getting closer. The ritual must be completed. I turned the pages faster now, my hands trembling. The entries grew darker with each passing day. There was talk of strange occurrences, voices, shadows that shouldn't have been there, cold spots that seemed to follow the writer through the house. The entries spoke of an obsession with something beyond the veil, and of doors that should never have been opened. May 4th, 1892. It is finished. The door has been opened. I can feel it now, watching from the other side. It calls to me, whispers in my ear. It is waiting for me. I slammed the journal shut, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The room around me felt suddenly darker, the shadows creeping in from the corners of the attic. My mind raced, images of the thing I had seen in the corner of the room that night flashing before my eyes. That presence, that thing, was it connected to this journal? Had the previous owner, Thomas Crow, opened something he shouldn't have? My hands shook as I stuffed the journal back into my bag and fled from the attic, shutting the door behind me. The house felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just old. It felt like something else was here, something waiting, watching, aware of my every move. The house was still, too still, after my discovery of the journal. I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over me like a thick fog. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows seemed amplified, like the house was watching me, and I was starting to feel like I wasn't alone in it. I spent the following day poring over the journal again. I had to know more about Thomas Crow, about the rituals he had spoken of. The more I read, the more the words blurred together. Rituals, chants, doors, shadows. It was as if the journal itself had become a dark puzzle I couldn't solve. The house was quieter than usual when night fell, the kind of silence that presses on your chest, making it harder to breathe. I stood in the kitchen, trying to distract myself with dinner, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The walls seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, and I couldn't help but glance nervously over my shoulder every few minutes. Then it happened again. The sound, a soft creak from above, followed by that same dragging noise. The sound of something heavy moving across the floor of the attic. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just the house settling. It couldn't be. I stood frozen for a moment, a wave of icy dread washing over me. It was like the air had thickened, pressing down on my chest. I had to go upstairs. I had to see what was causing it. I grabbed the flashlight that had been gathering dust in the drawer and slowly made my way toward the staircase. Each step I took echoed louder than the last, as if the house was amplifying every movement. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I paused, listening. The dragging noise came again, closer now, as if something was moving just on the other side of the attic door. I climbed the stairs quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top, the temperature seemed to drop, the air around me turning frigid. The attic door loomed ahead, its surface worn and warped from years of neglect. I took a deep breath and placed my hand on the knob, feeling the cold seep through my fingers. And then, for a fleeting moment, I thought I heard a voice, a whisper, barely audible, but they're all the same. "Help me." I jumped back, my pulse racing. No, it wasn't possible. But I'd heard it, hadn't I? I swallowed hard and, with a trembling hand, turned the knob and opened the door. The attic was dark, save for the faint light coming from the hallway. But what I saw inside made my stomach churn. The floor was covered in dust and cobwebs, just as I had left it. But there, in the center of the room, lay a large, dark shape. It was an old trunk, one I hadn't noticed before. I hadn't seen it the last time I was up here, and yet there it was, sitting in the middle of the room, like it had been waiting for me. My hands shook as I approached it, the creaking of the floor beneath me almost drowned out by the thudding of my heart. The trunk was ancient, its brass fittings tarnished with age. The smell of old leather and damp would fill my nose. I kneeled beside it, my fingers trembling as I reached for the latch. Click! The trunk opened with an eerie groan, revealing its contents, old, tattered blankets and scraps of cloth. But beneath them was something much darker. A journal. Another one, but this one was different. Older, more worn. It was bound in something that looked like human skin. its surface scarred and marked with strange symbols. I hesitated for a moment, my stomach churning, but something pulled me forward, and I opened the journal. The pages inside were filled with strange writings, words I didn't understand, written in a language I had never seen before. But one page caught my eye. It was a drawing, sketched in dark ink, of a door. Not just any door, but a gateway. At the bottom of the drawing were words, scribbled frantically, in the same hand as the journal I had found before. The door is open. It is coming. It calls to me. I slammed the journal shut, my mind reeling. The same words, the same warnings, the same terror. The house was no longer just an old, creaky building. It was something else, something that had been waiting for years, biding its time. I stumbled back from the trunk, my hands shaking, and in that moment I realized, whatever Thomas Crow had opened, whatever had come through that door, it wasn't done with me yet. The days that followed were a blur of terror. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me. At night, the noises grew louder. Footsteps, dragging sounds, faint whispers. They came from the walls, from the ceiling, from beneath the floorboards. But no matter how many times I checked, I found nothing. The house had no answers, only silence that stretched on and on until it cracked with something darker. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that the house was old and full of creaks and groans. But when the cold spots started appearing, areas of the house that felt unnaturally cold no matter how high I turned the heat, I knew I was lying to myself. I hadn't told anyone about the journals yet, not even Marjorie. What could I say? Oh, by the way, I found an ancient journal about occult rituals in my attic, and now the house is haunted. They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was. But the nightmares, those were harder to explain away. Each night, I was pulled deeper into sleep, trapped in a world where the house felt alive. The shadows whispered my name, and the walls pressed in around me, suffocating me. I'd wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, the feeling of something watching me lingering even after I opened my eyes. Then, one evening it happened. I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book. The air was thick, oppressive. The shadows seemed darker than usual, stretching longer across the room. I looked up from the pages and froze. The door at the end of the hallway, the one that led to the basement, was open. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't even thought about the basement. But there it was, wide open, as though inviting me to step into the darkness. I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me, and walked toward the door. The air grew colder the closer I got. The creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed deafening in the stillness. I paused at the door. A draft of icy air blew past me, sending a shiver up my spine. Without thinking, I stepped into the basement. It was pitch black. The light bulb overhead flickered intermittently, casting fleeting shadows across the damp walls. The air smelled musty, stale. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I didn't need to. I could feel it. Something was down there. A scraping sound came from the far corner of the basement. It was unmistakable. The same dragging noise I'd heard for days. It was closer now. Too close. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the corner, its back turned to me. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence. I could feel its eyes on me, even though it wasn't looking at me. I stood frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. The figure shifted, and that's when I saw it. A faint glimmer of something, a pale, skeletal hand reaching toward me from the darkness. It was as if it were beckoning me, drawing me closer. The air turned frigid, the temperature dropping so fast that my breath fogged in front of me. I stepped back, heart hammering in my chest, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic. The figure turned its head slowly. its face coming into view. Hollow, dark eyes stare back at me, empty and cold. A grin spread across its face, wide, unsettling, unnatural. And then, in a voice that sounded like nails scraping against stone, it whispered, "You shouldn't have opened the door." I stumbled backward, my legs buckling beneath me. I spun around, tearing up the stairs, my mind a blur of panic. The basement door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I pressed my back against it, gasping for air, trying to shake the image of that thing from my mind. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst. My body shook uncontrollably, and I could barely stand. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it had been waiting for me. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face of that thing, the hollow eyes, the grin, and the whisper, that voice that scraped my very soul, echoing in my mind. You shouldn't have opened the door. I tried to push it out of my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination, a trick of the dark, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever had been in that basement, whatever had stared at me with that unearthly gaze, wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. It was here. For days, I avoided the basement, avoided the dark corners of the house. I kept myself busy, packing up the last of the boxes, rearranging furniture, trying to ignore the growing dread that gnawed at me from the inside out. But every time I thought I could forget, I heard it. The tapping. At first, it was faint, barely audible, like someone tapping a fingernail against the wall. I would pause, listen, and it would stop, but it always started again, just when I thought I was safe. The sound would follow me, through the living room, down the hall, into the kitchen. It became louder, more insistent, as if it were beckoning me to come closer. I knew where it came from. I knew where it was leading me. The door, the attic door, the door that had never felt right since I moved in. I stood in front of it, my hand resting on the cold brass knob, my breath shallow and ragged. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to open it. The whispers were louder now. I could hear them, clearer than ever, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "Come closer," I shuddered, pulling my hand away from the door. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go back in there, not after everything I had already seen. But something inside me, something primal, pushed me forward. Without thinking, I turned the knob and stepped inside. The attic was as I had left it, dark, cluttered, and covered in dust. The faint light from the hallway spilled in through the cracks of the door, casting long shadows across the room. The air smelled of old wood and mildew, thick with years of neglect. I walked deeper into the room, my footsteps soft against the floor. And then, just as I expected, I saw it. The trunk. It sat in the center of the room, as if waiting for me to return. I approached it, my heart pounding, and knelt down in front of it. My fingers trembled as I reached for the latch. The trunk opened with a faint groan, revealing its contents. Another journal. This one was different, though. It wasn't bound in human skin like the other. This one was ordinary, with pages yellowed by time. But the moment I opened it, I could feel the air around me change. The room seemed to grow colder. The shadows seemed to shift. The first entry read, "The door is open. They are coming. I can hear them scratching, clawing. They're waiting to take me. I've made a terrible mistake." The writing became increasingly frantic as I flipped through the pages. Each entry grew darker, the handwriting more erratic. The last few pages were barely legible, scrawled in a frantic hand. I can hear them outside the door. They want to take me. I've opened the gate. It cannot be closed. I slammed the journal shut, a chill running down my spine. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that the entries were becoming more desperate, or the undeniable truth that someone had written these words, someone who had lived here before me. The door. I looked toward the far corner of the attic, where the door to the hidden room. The door I hadn't noticed before stood. It hadn't been there when I moved in. I was certain of it. But there it was now, cracked open just a sliver, the darkness beyond it thick and impenetrable. I could feel it. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't just a house anymore. It was them, the thing in the basement, the voices, the scratching, the whispers. It was all connected. I didn't know what would happen if I opened that door, but I had a sickening feeling it would be the end of whatever fragile sanity I had left. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to see what lay beyond it. And so I took one trembling step forward. The air grew colder as I approached the door. My fingers were numb from fear, but I couldn't stop myself from reaching for the handle. I pulled it slowly, carefully, dreading what I might find on the other side. The door creaked open, louder than I expected. The space beyond was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows light whole. I couldn't see anything. It felt like the room had no boundaries, like the darkness stretched on forever. I stepped inside, my breath fogging in the cold air, my heart thudding so loudly in my chest that it felt like it might burst. The flashlight in my hand flickered and then went out. No. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hand shaking uncontrollably. It clicked back on, but the beam was weak, barely piercing the thick blackness in front of me. But there, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw something, a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, but as I blinked and stepped closer, I realized it was real. Standing in the middle of the room was a silhouette, tall, thin, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching toward the ceiling. Its face was obscured in shadow, but the smell that wafted from it was unmistakable, sour, rotting, like something long dead. I froze. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me, and then, slowly, it shifted. Its head tilted to one side, as if it were studying me, trying to understand what I was. The air grew thick with tension, like the very house was holding its breath. I stepped back, but my legs felt weak. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing in the darkness. It was like it was pulling me in, like it had a hold on my very soul. And then it spoke. Its voice was low, raspy, like something scraping against stone. You shouldn't have come here. I stumbled back, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. The thing was speaking directly into my mind. I could feel its words, like a pressure in my head, pushing against my thoughts, filling every corner of my mind with dread. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, constricted, like something was choking me from the inside. I turned and ran, blindly crashing through the dark, my feet tripping over the uneven floor. The flashlight flickered again, casting wild shadows as I scrambled toward the door. I reached for the handle, but it was stuck. It wouldn't open. I turned back to face the darkness, and that's when I saw it. The figure was closer now. Its face was visible, but I wished it hadn't been. It was wrong. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets, and its mouth hung open too wide, as if it couldn't quite close it all the way. There was something moving inside its mouth, slithering, twisting, like worms or something worse, something that made my stomach churn. You shouldn't have opened the door, it repeated, the words slipping from its twisted lips like poison. I grabbed the door handle again, pulling with all my strength. And then, just as I thought I would be trapped forever, it gave. The door creaked open, and I stumbled into the attic, the blinding light from the hallway flooding in behind me. I slammed the door shut, gasping for air, my chest heaving. I leaned against it, trying to steady myself. My hands were trembling, my legs weak beneath me. I could still feel the presence of that thing, still hear its voice in my head. I thought I had escaped, but when I turned around, I froze. The trunk, the one I had closed only moments ago, it was open. Inside was a different journal, not the one I had found before, but one that seemed to call to me. I didn't know how it got there, but I couldn't ignore it. I walked toward the trunk, the air thick with dread, and then I saw it. The door, the doorway, a drawing in the journal, sketched in frenzied strokes. There was something on the other side of it, a shadow, a figure, too dark to make out clearly, but the writing beside it was clear. It's coming through. The door has been opened. It will never be closed again. I slammed the journal shut, my mind racing. Whatever was on the other side of that door, whatever Thomas Crow had summoned, it was coming. It wasn't just in the house anymore. It was in me. The room felt as though it was closing in around me. I couldn't escape it. The thing I had seen in the dark, the whispers, the scratching, the warnings from the journal. Everything was pointing toward one terrifying truth. I had opened the door, not just the attic door or the basement door, but something much larger, much more insidious. And now, there was no going back. I couldn't think straight. My mind was spiraling, overwhelmed by the things I had seen and the things I had heard. The house seemed to grow louder, the walls groaning and creaking as if the building itself were alive and trying to squeeze me out, to suffocate me in its grip. The whispers had begun again, not just faint, distant murmurs, but clear, sharp voices. I could hear them echoing from the walls, the floors, and even from the corners of my mind. It's here. It's waiting for you. Come closer. I covered my ears, trying to block them out, but it was impossible. The voices had become a constant presence, like they were seeping into every crack of my thoughts. They were everywhere, and they were growing louder. I stumbled to the door, wanting to escape, but as I reached for the knob, I felt something press against the back of my mind, a pressure, like something was watching me from just beyond my reach. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But as I turned the door handle, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't want to look. I couldn't bear to see what was coming toward me, but I knew I had no choice. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Each one seemed to echo off the walls of my skull, vibrating through my bones. And then, just as I thought I might lose control, the door creaked open. I turned, and there it was, the thing, the figure from the darkness. It was standing in the hallway, just outside the room, staring at me with its hollow, empty eyes. It was taller than before, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted, stretching toward the ceiling. The mouth was still wide open, but this time, there was something more, a shadow riding within it, something shifting and moving in the blackness. It didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to paralyze me with fear. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but I couldn't look away. It was as though I was trapped in its gaze, pulled deeper and deeper into that dark abyss. The room felt colder, the air thick with the weight of something ancient, something beyond comprehension. I felt as if the house itself was closing in around me, trapping me in its madness. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker and deeper. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the whispers stopped. The figure took a step forward, its eyes never leaving mine. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was like I was rooted to the spot, like I had no control over my own limbs. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw it. The attic door, the one I had closed moments before. It was open again. The darkness beyond it seemed to pulse, as if something were moving within it, something waiting for me. "You open the door," the thing whispered, its voice a rasping hiss that reverberated in my mind. "Now you belong to it." The word sent a jolt of cold panic through my veins. I had done this. I had opened the door. And now, whatever was waiting on the other side was coming for me. I managed to tear my gaze away from the thing, but it was too late. The darkness had already begun to swallow the room, spreading like an ink stain, creeping toward me. enveloping everything in its path. I could feel it closing in, like a vice around my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. My legs finally moved. I ran, stumbling through the hall, desperate to escape, but the house seemed to stretch, the walls distorting as if the very architecture were conspiring against me. I couldn't find the door. The exit was gone. I reached the staircase, but the steps were too steep. The walls pressed in around me, and I felt as if the house itself were trying to drag me back into its depths. I climbed, I ran, I crawled, but no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't outrun it. And then, just as I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it again, the figure. It was standing in the doorway, blocking my escape, its hollow eyes watching me, its mouth widening impossibly. I felt the pressure in my chest, the crushing weight of something dark and powerful pressing in around me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The darkness enveloped me, closing in like a suffocating shroud. And then everything went black. The room felt as though it was closing in around me. I couldn't escape it. The thing I had seen in the dark, the whispers, the scratching, the warnings from the journal, everything was pointing toward one terrifying truth. I had opened the door, not just the attic door or the basement door, but something much larger, much more insidious. And now, there was no going back. I couldn't think straight. My mind was spiraling, overwhelmed by the things I had seen and the things I had heard. The house seemed to grow louder, the walls groaning and creaking as if the building itself were alive and trying to squeeze me out, to suffocate me in its grip. The whispers had begun again, not just faint, distant murmurs, but clear, sharp voices. I could hear them echoing from the walls, the floors, and even from the corners of my mind. It's here. It's waiting for you. Come closer. I covered my ears, trying to block them out, but it was impossible. The voices had become a constant presence, like they were seeping into every crack of my thoughts. They were everywhere, and they were growing louder. I stumbled to the door, wanting to escape, but as I reached for the knob, I felt something press against the back of my mind, a pressure, like something was watching me from just beyond my reach. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But as I turned the door handle, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't want to look. I couldn't bear to see what was coming toward me, but I knew I had no choice. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Each one seemed to echo off the walls of my skull, vibrating through my bones. And then, just as I thought I might lose control, the door creaked open. I turned, and there it was, the thing, the figure from the darkness. It was standing in the hallway, just outside the room, staring at me with its hollow, empty eyes. It was taller than before, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted, stretching toward the ceiling. The mouth was still wide open, but this time, there was something more, a shadow riding within it, something shifting and moving in the blackness. It didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to paralyze me with fear. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but I couldn't look away. It was as though I was trapped in its gaze, pulled deeper and deeper into that dark abyss. The room felt colder, the air thick with the weight of something ancient, something beyond comprehension. I felt as if the house itself was closing in around me, trapping me in its madness. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker and deeper. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the whispers stopped. The figure took a step forward, its eyes never leaving mine. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was like I was rooted to the spot, like I had no control over my own limbs. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw it. The attic door, the one I had closed moments before. It was open again. The darkness beyond it seemed to pulse, as if something were moving within it, something waiting for me. "You open the door," the thing whispered, its voice a rasping hiss that reverberated in my mind. "Now you belong to it." The word sent a jolt of cold panic through my veins. I had done this. I had opened the door. And now, whatever was waiting on the other side was coming for me. I managed to tear my gaze away from the thing, but it was too late. The darkness had already begun to swallow the room, spreading like an ink stain, creeping toward me, enveloping everything in its path. I could feel it closing in, like a vice around my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. My legs finally moved. I ran, stumbling through the hall, desperate to escape, but the house seemed to stretch, the walls distorting as if the very architecture were conspiring against me. I couldn't find the door. The exit was gone. I reached the staircase, but the steps were too steep. The walls pressed in around me, and I felt as if the house itself were trying to drag me back into its depths. I climbed, I ran, I crawled, but no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't outrun it. And then, just as I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it again, the figure. It was standing in the doorway, blocking my escape, its hollow eyes watching me, its mouth widening impossibly. I felt the pressure in my chest, the crushing weight of something dark and powerful pressing in around me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The darkness enveloped me, closing in like a suffocating shroud. And then everything went black. I woke up in darkness, but it wasn't the same suffocating, oppressive darkness that had surrounded me before. This felt different. It felt real, like I had crossed some kind of boundary between the living world and something else. My eyes were open, but I couldn't see. There was no light, no shape or form, just blackness. Panic surged through me. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like I was stuck in mud or quicksand. My limbs wouldn't obey, and my throat constricted, as if some invisible force was holding me down, keeping me from breathing, from screaming. My chest felt tight, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The whispers started again, low and distant, but this time they weren't coming from the walls or the air around me. They were coming from inside my head. "You can't escape. You belong to it now." I struggled, my mind screaming for release, but the voices only grew louder. They filled the space around me, weaving in and out of my thoughts, clawing their way into my soul. The weight pressing down on me increased, and I could feel it. Something was holding me here, something invisible, unrelenting. "You're a part of the house now." I tried to speak, to shout, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the very air around me had been thickened, suffocated by the curse of this place. And then, slowly, the darkness shifted. It wasn't light, not exactly, but something was beginning to take shape. I saw shadows, vague outlines in the inky blackness. At first, they were just flickers, brief glimpses of movement, but then they grew clearer, more distinct. Figures, shapes. I couldn't make them out, but I knew they were there, watching me, waiting. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see their faces. The air grew colder again, and I shivered, trying to pull myself out of the weight that kept me anchored in place. But it was useless. I was trapped. One of the shapes stepped forward, its presence almost tangible, and for the first time since I had arrived in this nightmare of a house, I heard it speak. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The voice was deep guttural, like 1,000 voices were speaking at once, their tones merging into one terrible sound. It was the same voice I had heard in my nightmares, in the basement, in the attic. It was everywhere now. "Now you're ours." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen, caught in the web of darkness that surrounded me, the whispers growing louder, more demanding. The pressure on my chest intensified, and I felt as if I were suffocating. A cold, skeletal hand reached out from the shadows and touched my face. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Bony fingers grazing my skin, the chill of death seeping through me. My heart hammered in my chest, and I tried to pull away, but the hand gripped me, holding me in place. "You open the door," the voice repeated, this time more menacing, more intimate. "And now there is no escape." I closed my eyes, unable to bear it anymore. But when I opened them again, the shadows were gone. The darkness was gone. I was no longer in the suffocating void. I was in my room, but it wasn't my room. The walls were different, covered in cracks and peeling paint. The furniture was gone, replaced by old, rotting remnants of a past I couldn't place. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet. I looked around, trying to make sense of it, but as I took a step forward, the whispers began again. This time, they were coming from the walls, from the corners of the room. "It's too late. You can't leave. You're part of us now." I tried to move, but my body was heavy, unresponsive. I was stuck again, my mind screaming, but my limbs wouldn't listen. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't escape. The shadows moved closer. I could feel them closing in, wrapping around me, pulling me into their darkness. I heard the sound of footsteps again, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty room. And then I saw it, the door, the same door that had been in the basement, the same door that had led me to the darkness. It was standing open, inviting me back. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. But I knew what I had to do. I had to leave. I had to escape. If I didn't, I would never be free. But as I tried to move toward the door, I felt the invisible chains tighten around me. I couldn't go through. The house wouldn't let me. The darkness closed in again, and the shadows whispered in unison. "You open the door. You belong to us now." And just like that, I was pulled into the dark once more. The world felt as though it had shattered. The house, the room, the air. They were all one an overwhelming, suffocating entity that consumed me. I couldn't tell where the darkness began and where it ended. It was as if the very walls of the house had turned against me, every corner whispering, every shadow clawing at my mind. My thoughts were fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. But I had to keep moving. I had to break free. The door loomed in front of me, its wooden frame scratched and warped, the very surface of it pulsing with a life of its own. The whispers had become louder, more urgent, as if something was reaching out to pull me back. The thing that had been stalking me in the shadows, the thing I had seen in the basement, was no longer just a figment of my nightmares. It was real, and it was waiting. "You open the door," the voice echoed, more forceful now. "You can never leave." I gritted my teeth and pushed forward, my legs trembling beneath me, my breath ragged. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. My mind was unraveling, and every step felt like it might be my last. I reached for the doorknob, but the moment my fingers brushed against it, a sharp, piercing pain shot through my body, like I had touched something alive, something hungry. It was as if the house itself was resisting me, refusing to let me go. I yanked my hand back, gasping, but the pain didn't stop. It spread, growing, curling around my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, as if they were feeding on my fear. "You cannot escape. You belong to the house now. We will never let you go." I collapsed to my knees, my body racked with pain. My vision blurred, and I could barely breathe. The air around me felt thick, like I was drowning in it. And then, a sudden silence. The whispers stopped. I opened my eyes, unsure of what to expect, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the doorway. It was like a silhouette made of smoke, its outline barely discernible against the blackness. But there was something about it, something familiar, something that made my heart stop. It was me. It was me, standing in the doorway, but it wasn't. It was wrong. The figure was twisted, its features warped and distorted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. Its eyes were hollow, empty, but I could feel them staring at me, boring into me. I didn't understand. How could this be me? How could this thing be me? The figure spoke, its voice deep and distorted. You open the door. You belong to it now. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I could feel the shadows wrapping around me, suffocating me, pulling me toward the door. I could feel myself being dragged into it, into the darkness, into whatever had been waiting on the other side. And then the house began to shift. The walls groaned, the floors creaked, and the air grew colder, as though the entire structure was coming alive, reacting to whatever force had been unleashed. The shadows seemed to grow, spreading out in all directions, swallowing everything in their path. The figure moved closer, its form flickering, warping, as if it couldn't hold its shape. It reached for me, its arms stretching unnaturally long, its fingers cold as death. You opened the door, it repeated, its voice 1,000 voices, all twisted together. Now you are one of us. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The door wasn't just a portal. It wasn't just a gateway to the darkness. It was a doorway to something far worse. Something that had been waiting for centuries. Something that had always been here, hidden in the very bones of the house. The curse. It was real. And now it was mine. The shadows closed in around me like a tightening vice. I could feel them on my skin, their cold tendrils slipping through the cracks in my mind. The darkness wasn't just outside me now. It was inside, crawling through my veins, whispering in my ears, twisting my thoughts until they were no longer my own. My chest heaved as the weight of it pressed down on me, suffocating me in a way no physical force ever could. I tried to move. I tried to break free from the grip of whatever force held me in place, but it was no use. My body refused to obey. Every inch of me felt like it belonged to the house now, like I was a part of its dark, rotten core. And then the whispers came again, not from the walls or the air, but from inside me, echoing in the very depths of my soul. You open the door. You belong to it now. We are one. The figure in the doorway, my twisted, broken reflection, stepped closer, its form shifting and warping with every movement. Its face was a grotesque mask, its eyes hollow pits, its mouth stretched wide into a grin that could only be described as unholy. The air around it seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy, as though the very essence of the house had taken shape in that one horrifying image. And then, in a voice that sounded like a chorus of hundreds of voices, it spoke. You cannot leave. You opened the door, and now you are part of the curse. The house will never let you go. I stumbled backward, my hands desperately reaching for the walls, but there was nowhere to go. The room had become a maze of shadows, every corner bleeding into another. I could feel it. The house itself was changing, warping, pulling me deeper into its grip. The air was thick with a foul stench, a mix of rot and decay, as though the house had been dead for years, and I was only just realizing it. The figure loomed closer, its form blurring and distorting like a mirage. Its arms stretched out impossibly long, and before I could react, it seized me, its cold, skeletal fingers curling around my throat. I gasped, but no air entered my lungs. The pressure was unbearable. The darkness surged through me, filling me from the inside out, and I could feel my mind breaking, splintering into 1,000 pieces. My vision blurred, and the world around me began to fade. I was dying. I could feel it. But even as I lost consciousness, a single thought flickered through my mind. The house wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing thing, and it had claimed me. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the room. I was in the house, but not in the way I had been before. It was as though I had become the house, or rather, the house had become me. I could feel its walls, its foundation, its very essence coursing through my body. The darkness was inside me, a part of me now, and there was no escaping it. I was the curse, The whispers, the cold, the shadows. It was all mine to command now. The door had been opened, and now the house had a new inhabitant. It was no longer haunted by what it had been, but by me. The thing that had once been a reflection of my fear had become my reality. The curse that had lived in the house for so long was now mine to carry. And as I looked around, I saw the other shapes, the others who had once been like me, lost souls trapped by the house's malevolent power. They were trapped here, just like I was. Some of them tried to scream, tried to fight, but their voices were lost to the darkness. I reached out to them, my hand trembling, but I knew there was nothing I could do. We were all part of it now. I turned back toward the door. It was still there, but this time it wasn't a doorway to escape. It was the door that bound us. We couldn't leave. None of us could. The house had claimed us, and it would keep us forever. I stepped toward it, my new form moving as though I was part of the very structure of the house. The door swung open of its own accord, and as I stepped through, I felt myself become one with the shadows. I was no longer just a person. I was a part of the curse, and the house would wait for the next soul foolish enough to open its door. The house felt different now, as though it had consumed me completely. I no longer walked through it as a tenant, an intruder. I was part of it. The walls, the floors, the very air I breathed. They all pulsed with my presence. I could feel the house in my bones, a dark rhythm that synced with my heartbeat. It was both foreign and familiar, a place I had never truly known. But now, it was me. The door had opened, and I had crossed the threshold, not just physically but spiritually. I had become one with the curse, bound to this place, to the darkness within it. The whispers still filled my ears, a constant hum, a reminder of what I had lost. It is done. You are ours now, forever. I could no longer remember the life I had before, the life before the house, the life before the door. Everything was lost to the shadows now, faded like a dream. All that remained was the cold weight of the curse pressing down on me, heavy and relentless. As I wandered through the house, I could feel the presence of others, those who had come before me, who had opened the door and become part of the house's twisted history. They were here, their souls trapped in the same endless cycle. I could hear their faint cries, their desperate whispers, but I couldn't help them. They were as much a part of the house as I was now. The walls seemed to close in around me, the rooms shifting and warping as though they too were alive, breathing with the house's malevolent spirit. Each corner I turned felt like I was going deeper into its heart, the darkness expanding with every step. And then, as I reached the attic, where it had all begun, I saw it again. The door, the one I had opened, the one that had brought me here. It was open. The darkness beyond it beckoned, and for a moment, I wondered if there was still a way out, if there was still hope. But as I stepped closer to the door, I knew the truth. There was no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. The house was my prison, my curse, and I would never leave. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw something. A figure, standing at the threshold of the door. It was a person, a new arrival. They were staring at the house, at the door, hesitant, unsure. I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear I had felt when I first stepped inside, when I had first heard the whispers, when I had first seen the figure in the hallway. I stepped back into the shadows, watching them. This was how it always happened. The house waited. It called to them. It pulled them in, piece by piece, until they too were trapped, just like I was. It would not stop. It would never stop. I could feel the pull of the door again, the pressure to step through, to become part of the darkness once more. But I resisted. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was no longer just a victim. I was the one who watched, the one who waited, the one who waited for the next soul to open the door. And as I watched them, I knew the cycle would begin again.